Put me on the list.
Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. Once again, as members are now aware, we are back to allowing as many members who want to come into the committee We are, however, still doing it remotely for those who prefer to participate virtually. So towards that end, we have rules for that virtual participation, which I will read to get us started. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purpose of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding and voting. These members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. And finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceedings. Thank you. This morning we are having our full committee hearing on the Department of the Air Force for fiscal year 22. And with us this morning we have John Roth, who's the Acting Secretary of the Air Force, General Charles Brown, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and General John Raymond, Chief of Space Operations. Let me say right off the bat, you have the coolest flag back there. I don't know if it's because it's new or whatever, but it pops. So, you know, we look at that and it's like, it's got that, yes, as Rick Larson said, it's got that new flag smell to it. It's a good look. So welcome, gentlemen. Appreciate it. And these are very challenging times, as we know, and I think the dominant theme that has come out of the Biden administration is to really focus on Russia and China in particular, as the phrase has gone, the pacing threat that we face. And I think the most interesting challenge in all of this, as we're dealing with the other challenges haven't gone away. The transnational terrorist threats, Iran, North Korea, climate change, instability throughout the globe, they're still there. And your job and the job throughout the Pentagon is how do you continue to meet those ongoing threats while making that pivot to recognize the rise of China and to a different extent the challenges that Russia presents. And you will hear a lot this morning about all that you do not have. There is considerable concern that there is not enough money in this year's Pentagon budget. I will say I've been doing this for a little over 25 years now. I have not yet met the Pentagon official who would not like to have more money. And I understand that. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes that's necessary. But what I really want us to focus on, and what I've written about here recently, is how we can get more out of the money that we are spending. I think there's a considerable concern when you look at the last 20 years and you see a number of the big ticket programs that haven't worked out as planned, that have been over budget. In many cases, they've wound up being canceled before they were even used. We need to get better at that. Even if we had all the money in the world, it's not a good idea to waste it, to not have products and platforms that are actually doing what we intended them to do. In this area, certainly, you know, we've had the conversations about the expense of the F-35, you know, recognizing how important that platform is to our future. What can we do to get it at a more cost-effective rate? The cost of maintenance, the operating costs that come with it are much higher than we expected, and also we have not as yet achieved the capability that we were hoping to get. So what happened? How are we doing better? And what is the future of fighter attack aircraft? As we know, the INGAN program is in development now. How does that mix? We've had conversations about then how to use the, I forget, F-15EX, I think it is, to extend the life and capability of some of our older platforms. How is that mix working out? We've also, of course, had trouble with the tanker program. What have we learned from all of that, and what are we doing better now? Because I'll tell you this much, I'm absolutely convinced if we could go back the last 20 years and get after those programs that wound up being incredibly wasteful, did not perform, way over budget, we wouldn't have anything to worry about in terms of money. Now, I do understand that waste is part of all human endeavors. It's not like you can't go over to the Medicaid, Medicare programs and find waste, or we all experienced what happened with unemployment this past year. It happens, but we have to do better going forward to meet those challenges. And in particular, I want to emphasize the work of the Future of Defense Task Force and now the Supply Chain Task Force that is focused on how we can meet the emerging threats and emerging needs. Aside from Russia, China, the information warfare environment that we find ourselves in that makes the simple massing of firepower not the be-all and end-all anymore. If they can shut down, if our adversaries can shut down all of our systems by taking out one satellite or by using one cyber attack, then we've got a problem. We've got to update those systems, make them more survivable, and we also have to increase our capability of making the information systems of our adversaries vulnerable. We'd love to hear how that works out going forward. On the Space Force side, obviously it's a new entity. I really want to thank Ranking Member Rogers and Subcommittee Chairman Jim Cooper for their leadership in creating this. I think it was absolutely necessary. As mentioned, space is central to everything we do. We have to make sure that our satellites are survivable, redundant, and that basically they continue to do the critical work that they do. So we'd be really interested in hearing how we're doing on improving the quality of those satellites, space launch, everything that goes into making sure that we have the architecture up there that we need and that we can protect it, even in times of conflict. So I appreciate you all being here. Look forward to testimony. There's a lot to work on, a lot to talk about, and I know the members will have a lot of questions, so look forward to that discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Rogers for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate the witnesses being here and taking the time it takes to prepare for this. It's very helpful to us, and I appreciate your service to our country. I remain gravely concerned about the President's defense budget proposal. The defense top line constitutes a cut of over $4 billion in real dollars. With this budget, it appears risk is being driven by the top line instead of the top line being driven by risk. That means our warfighters are being deprived of the resources they need to deter and, if necessary, win a war against China or other adversaries. Even with an overall increase, the Department of the Air Force is still forced to make unnecessary sacrifices due to an inadequate top line. The Air Force is slashing its procurement budget by more than 12% and divesting over 200 aircraft. They tell me this will produce $4.5 billion in so-called savings the Air Force says it needs to invest in modernization, except that's not what's actually happening. Only half of the $4.5 billion is invested in research and development of modernized systems. I'm not sure what's happening with the other part of that $4.5 billion. I guess it's being spent on school bus electrification or some other non-defense priority the President has. These cuts and divestments greatly increase near-term risk by exacerbating gaps in capabilities. Put it bluntly, we're gambling that China or some other adversary won't force us into a conflict before 2030. That makes many of us uneasy. Making matters worse is the lack of a future year's defense program. Without it, Congress and the American people have no way of knowing whether these risks are being properly balanced. I strongly encourage the witnesses to produce a FYDP as soon as possible. Acting Secretary Roth, I continue to be disappointed with the slow implementation of the acquisition changes for the Space Force. Not only have you failed to get us the required reports, but the space acquisition position required by law remains unfilled. I remain very focused on these issues and expect to hear today how you plan to make up for lost time. This budget does have a silver lining. The bipartisan agreement to invest in and modernize all three legs of the nuclear deterrent seems to have held with this budget. Key programs such as the B-21 bomber, the long-range standoff weapon, and the ground-based strategic defense are fully funded. I also understand that GBSD will now be $38 billion cheaper than extending the aging Minuteman III. Obviously, this is good news. These programs began under President Obama and continued under the last administration. The bipartisan support from both Democrat and Republican presidents for these programs speaks volumes. I look forward to working with Chairman Smith, Chairman Reed, and Ranking Member Inhofe to ensure that continues. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. You are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm also honored to have General Brown and General Raymond join me here in representing the nearly 700,000 airmen and guardians that defend our nation. We are thankful for your consistent and persistent support over the years that has enabled us to build the world's greatest air and space forces. As an integrated force, our airmen and guardians stand ready, willing, and able to meet responsibilities to our nation and continue defending the high ground. From 300 feet to 300 miles off the ground, we protect the homeland, we project power, and we defend democracy. The long-term strategic competition with China and Russia demands that we focus on the capabilities we need to invest in today to win tomorrow. Our nation's competitive strategic advantage relies on air and space superiority, which is underpinned by rapid technological advancement and the extension of space as a warfighting domain. In line with Secretary Austin's priorities to defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork, our fiscal year 22 budget is the beginning of a journey to the air and space forces of 2030. It builds the capabilities that allow the department to modernize while continuing to meet national security objectives and defend the high ground. Specifically, we are committed to investing in 1, empowering airmen and guardians, 2, capability-focused modernization, 3, connecting us to the joint force, and 4, expanding partnerships. First, our airmen and guardians remain the heart of our ability to deter and, if necessary, defeat our competitors. We are transforming our talent management systems to ensure we develop and train leaders with competence, character, and skills required to win high-end fights. And we remain devoted to recruiting and retaining a diverse core of multi-capable, innovative talent to outmaneuver our adversaries today and in the future. We owe it to our force to provide them with an environment where all can thrive. That is why we are directing critical resources to rid our ranks of any corrosive elements and injustices that degrade our ability to provide a lethal, ready force. Second, to remain the world's greatest air and space force, we must look to the future through a lens of capability-focused modernization. Evidenced by nuclear modernization and the next-generation air dominance platforms, our digital acquisition approach revolutionizes how we design and field capabilities to the warfighters. Moving forward, we will expand on these digital revolutions while also investing in next-generation space systems that are resilient and defensive. Space is no longer a benign domain. Our U.S. Space Force is purpose-built to deter and protect free access to space. Third, combatant commanders require an agile military that operates seamlessly across all domains at both speed and scale. That is why we continue to invest in capabilities like the Advanced Battle Management System, our contribution to the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which will connect every sensor to every shooter across all domains. Likewise, access to and freedom of action in space is central to connecting us to the joint force. In its second year, the U.S. Space Force is laser-focused on integration. Investments in space capabilities increase the effectiveness of operations across all domains. The result is a U.S. military that is better connected, better informed, faster, and more precise. Finally, the U.S. Air and Space Forces do not fight alone. We benefit from the expertise and capabilities of our sister services and coalition forces, as well as from the whole of government, commercial industry, and academia. We will continue to invest in enduring relationships while expanding new partnerships to transform how we fight future wars. Members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to testify. I look forward to your support and am confident that with your help, the Air and Space Forces will be armed with the capabilities necessary to protect our nation and defend the high ground. We welcome your questions and ask that this opening statement be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. General Brown, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. I'm humbled to serve as the nation's 22nd Air Force Chief of Staff and to represent the 689,000 total force airmen serving today. The support of our airmen and their families is greatly appreciated. It's an honor to appear before you today with Acting Secretary Roth, my fellow service chief and longtime friend of many years, General Raymond. As a general officer, I've spent the last decade plus in joint positions overseas and/or supporting operations in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and most recently, the Indo-Pacific. With this context, I've been able to look at the Air Force from varied perspectives. And I've personally seen the reemergence of strategic competition and how the character of war has changed. The strategic environment has rapidly evolved, and we haven't changed fast enough. The People's Republic of China has recognized modern warfare is a contest among systems, not individual units or platforms. Accordingly, Secretary Austin has prioritized China as our pacing threat. Meanwhile, Russia continues to modernize its armed forces, increasing the capability of its missiles, strike aircraft, warships, artillery systems, and nuclear weapons. Competition in future warfare will be conducted across all domains simultaneously. It will be trans-regional and global undertaking with complex actions and actors intertwined. To account for these changes, our nation, our Air Force, must change faster than we have been. If we continue on a path of incremental change, our advantage erodes and losing becomes a distinct possibility. The Air Force recently updated our mission statement: to fly, fight, and win, anytime, anywhere. To execute this mission now and into the future, we must transition our Air Force and our operational concepts from today to tomorrow, and we must do so much faster. That's why I wrote Accelerate, Change, or Lose, to call attention to the changes in the strategic environment. Because of the mix of capabilities that our Air Force has now, that were good enough yesterday or good enough today, will likely fail tomorrow. Our future Air Force must be agile, resilient, and connected, with the ability to generate near instantaneous effects anytime, anywhere. Not just sometime in some places, but anytime, anywhere. Air Force is the only service that provides our joint teammates, allies, and partners the assurance of air superiority, the advantage of global strike, and the agility of rapid global mobility through a range of capabilities most requested by today's combatant commanders. Additionally, the Air Force's ISR and command and control capabilities provide the ability to sense, make sense, and act. But while our past and current capabilities have sufficed for the last 3 decades, they will not effectively perform in tomorrow's highly contested environment. To address these challenges that will endanger our national security tomorrow, the transition to the future Air Force design must start today. Finally, we must have a foundational responsibility to our airmen and their families. I remain focused on ensuring we are ready and that we have the tools and infrastructure and talent management systems to provide the environment where all can reach their full potential. The future Air Force design advances our core missions and new approaches to warfighting that holistically support every combatant commander and benefit every service chief. Investing in your Air Force is an investment in the joint force. Ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line is simple. We must modernize for the future and focus on capabilities that maintain our advantage both today and tomorrow. For decades, we collaborated with Congress, our industry partners, to modernize for the future. Now, to fulfill our responsibility to ensure our national security, we must be willing to change, to make the tough choices required to deliberately transform our Air Force to the future force we need to compete, deter, and win. We've done it before, and I'm confident together we can do it again. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Raymond.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you today with Secretary Roth, the Acting Secretary of the Air Force, and General C.Q. Brown, the Chief of the Staff of the Air Force, a longtime friend and teammate. On behalf of the Guardians stationed worldwide, let me begin by thanking you for the continued leadership and strong support that you provided to the Space Force. The United States is a spacefaring nation. We've long understood that our nation is strongest economically, diplomatically, and militarily when we have access to and freedom to maneuver in space. For the past 3 decades, we've been able to take that access and freedom to maneuver for granted. Unfortunately, as the National Defense Strategy and the newer Interim National Security Strategy identified, this is no longer the case. Both China, our pacing threat, and Russia are doing 2 things to eliminate the lead that the U.S. currently enjoys in space. First, they are rapidly developing their own space capabilities for their own use, giving them that same advantage that we enjoy. And secondly, they are building weapon systems specifically designed to deny U.S. capabilities in space and our access to space. These threats include robust jamming of GPS and communication satellites, directed energy systems that can blind, disrupt, or damage our satellites, anti-satellite weapons, both in space and launched from the ground, that are designed to destroy U.S. satellites in orbit, and cyber capabilities that can deny our access to the domain. Thankfully, with the strong support of this Congress, and especially this committee, the United States seized on the opportunity to make needed changes to stay ahead of that growing threat by establishing the United States Space Force. This leadership is resonating globally and is already delivering results for our nation. We have slashed bureaucracy at every level in order to empower our Guardians to move at speed and to increase the accountability necessary to operate in this domain. We have put together a forward-leaning human capital strategy, allowing us to build a more highly trained, educated, and developed warfighting force while taking care of Guardians and their families throughout their career. We wrote our first doctrine to clearly articulate the independent value of space power to joint and coalition forces, and this importance is fully captured in the Department's new joint warfighting construct that's being developed. Our international partnerships are stronger, with many of our partner nations following our lead by elevating space in their militaries. We have created a new end-to-end capability development process, from force design and requirements to acquisition and testing, enabled by a digital thread to move at speed while driving unity of effort across the department. We have rejected stovepipes by actively working with the joint force, other government agencies, and industry to compete, deter, and win at an affordable cost. The Space Force cannot and will not tolerate business as usual. Our demanding mission and lean force demand nothing less than a new standard of efficiency. This budget reflects the shift of many Department of Defense space activities into the Space Force, yet we remain roughly 2.5% of the overall Department of Defense budget. We are committed to stretching every dollar to its limit to buy as much capability as possible for our nation. Our joint force does not close on its warfighting requirements without space. Space is the force multiplier that we must continue to invest in so we can compete, deter, and win, and without it, we risk losing. This fiscal year 22 budget balances the need to protect capabilities that we have on orbit while shifting and modernizing to a more defendable architecture in the future. It is an investment that provides assured space capabilities to our sister services, our nation, and our coalition partners. These demanding tasks would not have been possible without the sustained support from Congress, including this committee, and for that, I thank you. Again, we cannot afford to lose space. I am absolutely honored and humbled to serve as the first Chief of Space Operations and to have the opportunity to serve side by side with the incredible Guardians that I'm privileged to lead. It is because of them that our nation enjoys the benefits of space today, and it is because of them, America's sons and daughters, that we will compete, deter, and win in the future. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General Raymond, on the satellite issue that I raised, in simplest terms, what do we need to do? What are the most critical steps necessary to make sure that we have the architecture in space that we need and that we can protect it?
Yes, sir. We have to shift to a new architecture. We have to modernize our forces. The capabilities that we have in space today are exquisite. They're the world's best. They're expensive, but they're not defendable. They were built for a different domain. We have to shift. And we have to shift to a more diversified architecture, and we have to shift to an architecture that has resiliency built into it and not bolted on as an afterthought. We have, as you mentioned in your opening comments, sir, we've got to figure out how to do this and what we might do differently to leverage our advantage. And I think there's two things we can do in space. The first thing is we can leverage a burgeoning commercial industry to greater capability than we're doing today, and we need to. The other thing that we need to do is we need to leverage our international partners to a greater extent. The way we get after this is by designing a force structure that allows all to play, to be coalition-friendly from the beginning, and to allow these small, innovative companies to have more of a premier role in that architecture.
What's in the budget this year that you would point to and say this is what's moving us in that direction? What are your biggest priorities in this year's budget?
The biggest priorities in this year's budget, if you look at the budget, we balance four things. We balance protecting what we have. We've been working on that for the last couple of years. We balance shifting to a new architecture, and there's examples in the budget where we're doing that. Third is we have to develop an offense to be able to deny benefits to an adversary to impose costs. And third, we have to look at what other missions that currently are being done in other domains that should shift to space, and you'll see examples of that as well. It's that balance that we're trying to get right, and again, by developing an architecture that is more diversified, we think we can do it in a way that doesn't break the national treasury.
And General Brown, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, so what is your vision, 5, 10 years, well, from now through the next 5 or 10 years for our fighter attack aircraft, between the F-35, the NGAD, proposals for the more F-15EXs? How does that mix work?
What we want to do as an Air Force is have a mix of multi-role capability across the fleet of fighters. And right now we have a 7 fighter fleet going down to a 4+1. And in that 4+1, the F-35 is the cornerstone of that capability. It's the only 5th-gen capability that we are building today. Tied to that is the NGAD. That will be the replacement for the F-22. The F-22 we will continue to modernize to ensure that it has the capabilities to meet the threat over the next 10 to 15 years as we bring NGAD on, which brings on an additional system to provide range and reach, particularly for air superiority. The F-15E that we currently have today will be complemented by the F-15EX, and the F-15EX will be a replacement to the F-15C, again, a multi-role capability. It will actually be able to carry a much larger weapons load on this particular platform and provide us some additional capability with a newer platform that helps drive down our average age of our fleet.
And I'm sorry, and are you confident that this budget supports that vision?
I am. It's as I mentioned in my opening comment, we are in a position of transition, and that's the aspect of starting down the path of really for the F-15EX to replace the F-15C, because the F-15C has been around for a period of time and starting to really show its age. The other is the F-16, as part of this 4+1. The newer F-16s will retire some of the older block F-16s, but the newer block still has another 15 to 20 years of service life on it as well. And then the last one is the A-10. The A-10 has been a great platform, particularly in the past 20 years in our fight in the Middle East. We will continue to we'll take a small reduction in A-10s in this particular budget, and then modernize and re-wing the remaining A-10s, and the A-10 will be with us really into the middle of the next decade.
Wow. Thank you very much. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Brown, I've made it pretty clear in my opening statement that I'm unhappy with this top line. Yesterday, we had your naval counterparts sitting at that table, and General Berger said, and I quote, "If our budgets don't even match inflation, then the risk is high that at some point in the future, we're overmatched. And that's not a place I want to be," close quote. Admiral Gilday said, quote, "If the Navy's top line remains flat or lower, the fleet will decrease," close quote. Do you share their concerns about this top line and what it would mean to our readiness and capabilities?
Ranking Member Rogers, I do. And this is why, this is exactly why I wrote Accelerate, Change, or Lose. Because I do see risk if we do not whether you increase the budget or not, and realize the increasing budget will be helpful, but as the chairman mentioned, we got to do things differently, a bit smarter in executing the budget we do have. And part of that is actually, as part of in this FY22 budget, the ability to modernize, which includes retiring and making a transition from where we are today to a more modernized fleet in the future, aircraft fleet in the future, and capabilities in the future to ensure that we do not have future risk. And that's a balancing risk between where we are today with today's combatant commanders, in addition to ensuring not all of the risk is incurred 10 to 15 years from now, not only for the Air Force and the Joint Team, but also for the nation.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with the chairman's view about being smarter. And one of the ways we've got to be smarter is with the F-35 and getting the problems worked out there where we don't have the problems that we suffer now. But going back to Admiral Gilday and General Berger, both indicated their support for the National Defense Strategy Commission's recommendation for a 3 to 5% increase in defense spending. Do you share their support of that recommendation?
I do.
All right, and I want to ask, you heard me say in the opening statement that your FY22 procurement request is 12% lower than FY21. Explain to me how we're going to be able to maintain readiness to meet peer threats with that reduction.
Ranking Member Rogers, it's a combination of, in order to, we've actually increased our RD&T&E and so our research and development. And part of that research and development is going to help us make that transition to additional capabilities. At the same time, we're looking to modernize with our procurement. It's important that as we procure, that we are procuring capabilities that are going to be relevant for the future. And that's where the RD&T&E comes into this as well. So from my perspective, to be able to balance between the procurement and the research and development to ensure we're getting the right capabilities, particularly as you look at a more software-focused approach with our digital acquisition approach with digital engineering, open mission systems, and agile software. Moving down that path is where we'll be able to be very responsive against the threats we expect that we see today and the threats we expect to see in the future.
Right. Secretary Roth, when can we expect to see someone nominated to fill the Assistant Secretary for Space Acquisition and Integration?
Yeah, we need to fill the position. So I concur with everybody's concerns that that position has not been filled. I think, as you're aware, it's a Senate-confirmed political appointee. So we would have to await a nominee, and the nominee would have to go through the confirmation process.
When are you going to nominate somebody?
Well, as you well know, it's not my call. So I would hope sooner rather than later. I mean, for the time being, we're looking forward to actually getting the Secretary of the Air Force confirmed. And then after that, to your point, filling in the rest of the team. That's an important position, and we really do need to fill it. Let me make one point. One issue, perhaps why it wasn't filled previously, is that position is supposed to be the Service Acquisition Executive for Space, but not until 1 October 22. And so our thought is that maybe to amend the language a little bit to say no later than 1 October 22, because you want the person who takes that position to hit the ground running in terms of taking charge of space acquisition.
Yeah, and not screw it up.
Yes, sir.
When are we going to get the FIDEP?
Yeah, that too is, I have to defer to OSD. You have to understand that as we prepare this FY22 budget with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the focus, given the short time frame, and we were late to begin with, but given the short time frame, the focus was entirely on FY22. There were no decisions made about the out years, so there really isn't an out year fit-up to be provided at this point in time.
My last question is to Secretary Roth. Over half of the KC-46A fleet is under contract, and we still don't have an aircraft that can reliably hold or deliver fuel. The earliest these fixes are projected to be ready is 2024. Has the Air Force considered recompeting that contract?
We have not considered recompeting that contract. We think the best way forward, there are things the airplane can do today, including refueling, medical kinds of things, and also, passengers and the type of things. So it is participating in exercises and doing a real job. And we think we would be best served taking delivery of the aircraft that are under contract and then proceeding, as you indicated, to fix the things that need to be fixed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes. Before I do that, we stick to a strict 5-minute thing here, so if you're in the middle of an answer, I'm not being rude, but I will cut it off to get to the next person. So if we can try to hit that 5-minute mark to the extent possible, that will be helpful to the committee. Mr. Lancherman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Got you loud and clear.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and for your service to the country. I'd like to start with General Brown, if I could. General, the Air Force continues to make great progress with directed energy. The Thor system was successfully tested overseas, and I applaud the establishment of the directed energy utility concept experiment for airborne laser systems. General, how do directed energy weapons fit into the Air Force of the 2030s?
First of all, I appreciate the question. As you highlight, we've made some progress using directed energy against our small unmanned aerial systems. But what I think about this capability has great potential when you look at critical infrastructure and base defense in the future. There's work to be done in the aspect of technology, but the thing that makes it attractive to me is the cost curves that we're using directed energy against a much less expensive directed energy versus a missile interceptor against the incoming threats we might have in various locations. So it's not only putting on aircraft, but even for ground-based defense or around our bases, I think will be important on how we develop and continue to use directed energy.
Thank you, General. To another area, the Air Force's written testimony states that the Air Force is prioritizing ABMS resources for investment in digital network, environment, and infrastructure. However, $150 million of the $203 million budget is for the airborne edge node. How is devoting 2/3 of the advanced battle management system budget to a single communications pod prioritizing network infrastructure?
Well, as we do the airborne edge node, that is the first major step of us putting ABMS on our aircraft, and it goes on to the KC-46. So it's not just the KC-46, but it actually starts the process for us to be able to continue to develop that capability to put on other airplanes and other communication nodes to really drive the aspect of ABMS to create a network of capability to be able to use and push information. Because ABMS is really about pushing information to drive decision-making for the Joint Force and the Air Force.
And in the era of great power competition, we're going to be playing the away game on a field that's tailored to deny our advantages. General, what are you doing to protect our systems, both from cyber and electronic warfare threats, but also ensuring and improving the survivability of assets like tankers and command and control platforms that are high value and easy to shoot down targets?
There's a combination of things, as you highlight, for cyber, in particular, as we work with Cyber Command on that capability, but also internal to the Air Force of the ability, as we go forward and work our oncoming systems to ensure they have the appropriate cybersecurity to be able to execute the mission. At the same time, from a broader aspect, how we modernize our force to ensure that survival in the future will be important based on the technologies that are available as we continue to move forward. And then the last piece is our ability now to use agile combat employment as one aspect, but also with ABMS to be able to connect to increase the situational awareness for our force, helps improve their survivability and their decision-making as we work as part of the Air Force, but also with the joint team on cyber and other areas to protect the force and execution.
Thank you. Last question for General Raymond. For most of our efforts in directed energy have been focused on terrestrial assets, but directed energy weapons are a significant threat and possible defensive tool for space assets. From your perspective, are we developing our directed energy portfolio appropriately to be an effective capability for space dominance?
Yes, sir, we are. And what I'd offer to you is I'd like to come back and get you in a closed hearing and be able to go into more details on exactly what it is that we're doing. But it's important, as you said, we have to be able to protect these capabilities that we rely so heavily on. The force design work that we're doing takes that into account. It balances our ability to accomplish the mission the ability to protect and defend that mission, and cost, and how fast you can get those capabilities on orbit. I'd welcome the opportunity to go into much more details in a classified setting.
I'd welcome that too. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, and all of our witnesses being here today. Especially meaningful to me as the son of a World War II Army Air Corps veteran of Flying Tigers in China and India. And as I mentioned to you, too, I'm also the grateful uncle of a person serving in the Air Force right now. So I know firsthand of your success and capabilities. General Brown, I'm grateful to support the men and women of the 169th Fighter Wing at McEntire Joint National Air Guard Base in South Carolina. McEntire has been successful in limiting their pilot manning gap, maintaining 95% of their fighter pilot requirement. This contrasts with overall Air National Guard component fight pilot inventory of 76%, a gap that's persisted for several years. What specific lessons can be learned by shared components to reduce the fighter pilot shortfall across the service, and how does the FY22 budget request support your pilot shortfall mitigation strategy?
Well, thank you for the question, and having spent 4 years at Shaw, I'm very familiar with the Joint Base McEntire. There's two aspects when we look at our pilot training, our pilot shortfall. It's production and retention. You highlighted retention, and that's an area that we're working on. We have had a little bump during COVID, but the key aspect for me is production, and not only for the active duty, but really for the total force as well. And so in the FY22 budget, we were focused on production with pilot training next as one of the aspects. How we work with our civilian sim instructor for locality pay, paths and initiatives for accelerated path to the wings using as members or individuals come in that actually already have flying experience, and how we adapt our course to use that. I will also share with you that during COVID, we were able to maintain a same level of production that we did in a pre-COVID environment, and which to me shows the real quality and dedication from our airmen to be able to deliver in a very different environment. Our goal is to get to 1,500 a year, and I think we are on that path.
And thank you for raising your Shaw heritage. I'm really grateful. I somewhat share that with Congressman Jim Clyburn and Congressman Ralph Norman, but I also appreciate the cooperation between McEntire and Shaw, how beneficial that is for both bases. Also, General, as a former Air Component Commander for the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, you understand the increasing complex security environment posed by China's peacetime military buildup better than most. In fact, this is the largest peacetime military buildup in the history of the world. Our reliance on well-developed airstrips at established bases of vulnerability against China, where their missile arsenal is capable of neutralizing our major force projection platforms. How does this budget support efforts to build expeditionary air launch capabilities throughout the Pacific? How are you adapting these capabilities to accommodate the logistical requirements of the F-35 platform?
There's a combination of things. First of all, when you think about air launch weapons, our aspect is we are focused on, we've reached the inventory for some of our preferred weapons that we use in today's inventory. But it's also how we look at some of our more advanced weapons like JASSM, or hypersonic capability to provide us additional capabilities against that increasing threat. From a aspect of logistics and working across our force, agile combat employment and our ability to look at how we deploy differently and how we organize a little bit differently within and how we support from a logistics standpoint will be important. And then finally on F-35 and its logistics, the ability over the past 2 years, we've actually had deployments of F-35s where we learned quite a bit, particularly in the Middle East, and now how we expand that capability to be able to deploy and understand the logistics aspects of supporting the F-35. We've made some progress and done fairly well in the Middle East. It's now time to expand that and look at how we do this in the Indo-Pacific as well.
And hey, as we conclude in regard to F-35s, I'd like to point out what a wonderful facility McEntire would be for F-35s. And we've already seen the success of F-35 deployment in South Carolina at the Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station. and they are indeed appreciated as the sound of freedom. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Brown, this KC-46A tanker question. The Air Force, I believe, has requested $73.5 million in RDT&E for the 46A. Is that funding going to help address the 6 Category 1 deficiencies in the 46? If not, what's the other use for that?
It is, and two key areas on the KC-46 that this will help address is a stiff boom, which is a challenge for some of our aircraft, particularly at higher altitudes and heavy weapons loads. And then the other is increased communications on the KC-46 to make it compliant with some of the DoD mandates, international mandates, to be able to operate in various airspace. And that's where a good portion of that money is going to.
A large portion of that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, great. Second question for you, and on a different issue, can you just outline the AFWERX budget in FY22 and the areas where that can be streamlined or improved? And that might be for Mr. Roth as well. But maybe Mr. Roth, go ahead.
Okay.
Secretary.
Well, first of all, I mean, we're very excited about AFWERX. I mean, AFWERX is exactly the kind of thing we think we need to be involved in going forward. I mean, one word or one phrase for the leader of AFWERX is he's our chief commercialization officer. And so the whole point of AFWERX is to leverage our money with commercial money and to see what kinds to bring into the Defense Department, bring into the Air Force the kinds of actors and players and contractors that don't normally do business with us. And so, for example, for the last 2 years, in 19 and 20, AFWERX awarded something on the order of 1,400 contracts worth about $700 million. 75% of those contractors were with new performers, okay, people who had not done business with the Defense Department before. And so, again, we're pretty excited about what they can do and how we can leverage them going forward. And in fact, we think they were such a good idea, we're going to stand up a SpaceWorks as well to try to see if we can expand the kinds of initiatives that we have.
All right, that's fair enough. Last year, Representative Don Young and I had a provision in the NDAA to submit a report on upgrading the DEW sites, the Defense Early Warning Sites in Alaska. We want to know what the status either of those upgrades are or the status of the report is for the record.
I will have to follow up in terms of what the status of the report is. We do have money in the budget to look at, continue to look at emerging technologies for the North Warning System. So we're continuing to get after that. We'll have to follow up and get back to you on exactly where that report is.
I appreciate that. It was in the NDAA and did ask you to get back to us on that. As well, General Van Herk testified to this committee on his concerns as Commander Northcom on his inability to have really a full situational awareness when it comes to threats across the pole. And perhaps in that future closed meeting we have with you, you can, from the Air Force and Space Force perspective, help us understand how you're working with Northcom to address those known gaps for detecting threats. Can I get a commitment on that from you all? I see nodding heads, but can you say yes?
Yes,
so
sir.
Clerk can pick that up?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. And then finally, and I probably for, I don't know, for Secretary Roth or General Brown, this is a 5G question. It's not necessarily an ABMS question, just to be clear about it. But how are you planning to integrate the use of 5G as your backbone for communications infrastructure in ABMS? And are any of there are 12 DoD pilot projects on 5G throughout bases in the CONUS, any of those related to learning about how to apply 5G into ABMS?
Well, I can start, and the General can fill in some blanks. Again, moving...
30 seconds.
Yes, okay. Moving data at speed and scale is the essence of the Joint All-Domain Operations. It's the essence of the Advanced Battle Management System. It's the essence of warfare in 2030. So capabilities like AI, machine learning, and 5G are all important aspects of the connectivity that we need to seek for the future.
And we are using it, particularly out at Nellis, to help us with the ABMS and learn more about how to use 5G.
So more about Nellis?
Right.
And Nellis, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Turner is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as I've told you personally, I'm a big fan of yours. I appreciate your service and your appearing before the committee and your answers today. And I want to thank you for your career of service at DOD. You come from a finance background, and so I'm going to ask you a question that relates to that. This year, we received the budget in June, which means that there's no way, of course, we're going to be able to get any of our work done before the fiscal year. As you know, there's no real rational basis as to why we operate under the fiscal year that we do. It is legislative. We could fix it. We could move the fiscal year to the calendar year, which would save 3 months annually for the Department of Defense. Could you please give us some perspective in your experience as to the effects of continuing resolutions, both financially and capabilities-wise, for the Department of Defense, and would moving the fiscal year to the calendar year help?
Well, in terms of managing under continuing resolution, I think for better or worse, unfortunately, we have a lot of experience managing under continuing resolutions. So I would say short term, and I'm talking about a matter of a couple of months, that we've adjusted our spending patterns in a way that we can probably accommodate a fairly short-term continuing resolution, 2 to 3 months and that type of thing. Anything beyond that, as you know, the restrictions against new starts or expanding any efforts and all start to hurt dramatically and start having both contractual and operational impacts as well. So long-term continuing resolutions are very corrosive and will require a lot of sort of alternative Plan B kinds of things, breaking contracts into smaller pieces, which end up costing you money in the long run. Back to your reference to my many years in this building, unfortunately, I can actually remember when we shifted to 1 October, okay? I was a young pup at the time, but I actually went through the transition. It was back in 76 and 77. And the idea there is to provide more time to get all the appropriations and authorization acts done in time, because at the time, the fiscal year was 1 July. Through 30 June. And so you can see how that worked out. So my only caution is, I don't know, work seems to expand to fill the vacuum, so to speak, and not sure that that's ultimately a solution. Closing out a fiscal year, in moving the beginning of a fiscal year to 1 January, you're also then closing out a fiscal year in December. And that gets to be problematic for the staff. You're talking about Christmas and December and trying to do all the accounting adjustments and contracting to end a fiscal year. So it just becomes a bit of an administrative burden. But, you know, the track record of actually getting bills done by the beginning of a fiscal year, no matter which date you pick, has always been a challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that. General Raymond, thank you for your leadership. You're the first in the nation to be our Chief of Staff for Space Force. You have made it a point to ensure that there's greater declassification of information as to what our adversaries are doing. That has had a great deal of effect on our ability to debate policy. Would you please talk a moment about that process and how important you believe that is?
I think it's absolutely critical. Our goal is not to get into a conflict that begins or extends into space. It's to deter it. And if you want to deter, you have to be able to message to your adversaries. We have seen both China and Russia develop capabilities and test those capabilities in a very concerning way. This past year, I talked very publicly for the first time about a Russian anti-satellite weapon that was purpose-built to destroy U.S. satellites in low Earth orbit. And that satellite's like the Russian nesting doll. It's the doll inside of a doll inside of a doll. And the doll launches, it opens up, another satellite comes out. It opens up and sends out a projectile. Not safe and responsible behavior, not professional behavior. We've called them out, and since that time, Russia has actually come to the table. We've had some strategic dialogue talks with them. So it is extremely important that the average person understands just how reliant they are on space and understands just how vulnerable they are with the threat that we're seeing today.
General Brown, we have three administrations who have supported nuclear modernization and the ground-based strategic deterrent. Could you speak for a moment how important it is that we support and complete the nuclear modernization in light of what our adversaries are doing?
Sure. We need to have a safe, secure, reliable nuclear portfolio that still deters a threat. And so we do have an advancing threat. And it's important we keep ground-based strategic deterrent and other aspects of our nuclear portfolio on track.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've already noted the historic nature of this hearing. To have General Raymond here as a co-equal service chief is indeed a historic moment. I have the opportunity to speak with General Raymond with some frequency, so I would like to yield now to Elaine Luria for my questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cooper. So, General Brown, I was looking in 2009, there was a new, but actually an old concept that emerged called the air-sea battle. And this had the goal of countering what was then termed the A2AD threat in the Western Pacific Theater of Operations. And I think it's already been stated through your remarks here today that you do consider China as our most immediate threat. Looking at this threat, would you consider a conflict with China primarily, if not exclusively, an air-sea battle?
I do think based on where I see the threat going, it's not just air-sea, but I'd also say that the first mover would probably be in cyber and space, which is why I'm happy to have General Raymond here with me and really part of the Department of the Air Force that we can work very closely. But just looking at the environment of where, how quickly things can happen, air definitely plays a role. To me, that's an aspect of being able to understand our capabilities in the air, as well as watching how the People's Republic of China has really advanced their capability in terms of their Air Force as well. And to me, that's why I really do see both air and sea, but really across the joint team and across all domains is where I expect a conflict to occur.
But going further with that, actually, they say that no good plan survives the enemy. Well, this plan of developing an air-sea battle, it didn't survive contact with the Joint Staff. So in 2015, it was consumed in the name of jointness, and a spokesman said the missing part of the air-sea battle concept was the land portion. So just think about that. The missing part of an air-sea battle concept was the land portion. So I guess the spokesman both forgot about the Marine Corps and also the concept within the Western Pacific. Would you agree that it is not part of our plan or strategy or thought that we would actually conduct a large-scale land invasion in any conflict with China?
What I really believe is you look into where we are today as a joint force, and you look at the joint fighting concept, you're going to have capabilities across all domains, across all services.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, do you envision a large-scale land invasion in a conflict with China?
It's hard to predict what would happen, but I want to make sure we have options in the future to ensure that we can use all of our joint capabilities.
Since this is a budget hearing, just wanted to shift to your budget submission. Yesterday, we talked to the Navy about their budget submission. One thing remains true from year to year. It seems that each service is getting a 1/3 share. So, in my opinion, at least, it doesn't seem that the next large-scale conflict in the Western Pacific, if that were with China, would require a large standing army. But that's exactly what we have, and that's exactly what this defense budget submission calls for. So do you agree with that current apportionment within the Department of Defense, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for each service, or do you believe that the Air Force and the Navy require more resources in order to deal with this current conflict?
Naturally, I would like to have more, but I also think it's the analysis that we have to do with the internally the Air Force to make the case for the things that we need to support not only the Air Force but also the Joint Force. But as we look at the joint warfighting concept, how we look at the redundancies between the services, how we look at the gaps to ensure we have the right capabilities, not only for the Air Force, but for the Joint Force as well.
So I wanted to point out an article that came out recently called The Budget and Fleet That Might Have Been, and including their fleet, Air Force as well, by Blake Hertziger. And, it suggested a small cut in the Army could yield huge returns for the Navy and the Air Force alike. And only have a little bit of time left, but out of this air-sea battle came a focus on anti-ship weapons delivered from the air. So several quick questions. How many bombers do you have in the Western Pacific today armed with the AGM-158? And how many AGM-158s did you request in this year's budget?
I'd have to, well, we don't have a continuous bomber presence in the Indo-Pacific today. And so we have a bomber task force that goes in and out, and I'll have to get you the exact numbers of the munitions.
Okay, and how many quick strike mines do you have in today's inventory?
I'd have to get back to you on that one as well.
Okay, and how many bombers will you remove from the Air Force's inventory this year?
It'll be 17.
Okay.
And that's in fiscal year 21.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I appreciate your comments that you feel you need more resources. But the point of my line of questioning was to say that I really strongly believe that the Air Force and the Navy have a larger role to play in the Western Pacific, and was hoping that you would come here, just as Admiral Gilday yesterday, and advocate for that, because I think this is truly essential to the defense of our nation and what we might face in the Western Pacific in the future. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lambert is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Roth, now I agree almost all the time with my colleagues and friends from Alabama, but there is one issue I have to raise where we do differ. Colorado Springs, although the home of Space Command currently, was rejected in favor of Huntsville for its future home. Now, Huntsville has a great history in rocketry, missile defense, and civilian space, but military space is an entirely different world. Operating and defending satellites, both DoD and IC satellites, is done almost exclusively now in Colorado Springs, where 7 of the 9 space deltas or space wings now reside, and one other is nearby in Colorado and one other is in California. Ripping the command away from operations and moving it 1,000 miles away makes no military sense. Our understanding is that this was a political decision made by the last administration, and the Air Force, while initially selecting Colorado Springs, had to go back and scramble to justify a different siting decision. So, Mr. Roth, last month during testimony, General Dickinson told us that civilians were the bedrock of Space Command and he wants to incentivize as many as possible to move. He also admitted that Huntsville did not have a survivable communications network, which does exist in abundance at the current location in Colorado Springs, and that such a network would have to be built from scratch at great expense in Huntsville. Despite this, the Department of the Air Force said of their basing process that they did not consider the cost of moving civilians or attrition rates, and they did not consider survivable communications as a requirement. And lastly, when General Raymond commanded Space Command, he operated out of Peterson's Building 1. American taxpayers have recently invested millions to upgrade facilities at Peterson in order to enhance Space Command's capabilities. So the command is even more entrenched there, and yet the Air Force did not even consider keeping the headquarters in Building 1. So how seriously should we view a process that did not consider the cost and attrition rate of moving civilians, the survivable communications requirement, and using existing infrastructure, among many other significant flaws?
The selection of Huntsville as the preferred location by my predecessor was the result of our strategic basing process. And that process is an analytically based process that used something on the order of, I think, 21 criteria. In both cases, in both Colorado Springs and in Huntsville, Alabama, both were going to require new buildings. Based on the requirement for something north of 1,400 people, we were going to have to build a building, whether it was in Colorado Springs or whether it was in Huntsville. And it turns out the basic construction costs and the maintenance costs and the like in Huntsville was significantly less than Colorado Springs. I have personally no evidence that the decision was politically motivated. It was the result of our strategic basing process, and we have worked with all the stakeholders to try to do the analysis, and we're now in the process of doing the environmental analysis. As I think you're aware, the GAO and the DODIG are going and looking at and analyzing and investigating the basis of the decision. So I will yield to them and see what it is, in fact, they find. I think the results aren't going to be available until later this year.
Okay, let me interrupt because time's running out. So you'll commit to providing the committee with all of the background documents and internal communications of the Department of the Air Force's Space Command decision-making process, both the original one that was scuttled and the second one which was completed in January of this year?
Yeah, I think to a large extent we already have. We try to make the process as open and transparent as possible. If requested, we will send you to folks who were involved in that decision, and we'll walk you through the criteria and the math and all of that.
Okay, thank you, because there are some things still missing there. And changing subjects, you mentioned the environmental assessment. Redstone Arsenal has been listed on the EPA's national priorities list as a Superfund site since 1994. Was its status as an EPA Superfund site considered during the basing decision process?
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you. I'm not aware whether it was or was not. We'll have to get back to you with that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here this morning. I'd like to spend a few minutes on airlift, which again, at the Projection Forces Subcommittee, myself and my colleague, Mr. Whitman, have been very involved with the KC-46, the C-130s programs, as well as the B-1 bombers. So I actually think the KC-46 path that's now set is somewhat of a good news story. I think Dr. Roper from the Air Force did a good job in terms of forcing Boeing's hand to get a hardware solution to the RVS problem. I would just note that Congress and the NDAAs kind of put some steel in his spine in terms of making sure that we were not going to accept a platform that was not adequate for the crew. And now it's all about execution. Our sort of guiding principle was to make sure that we were listening to Transcom as well as the Air Force during this whole process. It does seem that now the two have come together in terms of a way to use KC-46s in a less sort of intensive, I guess, manner while we're transitioning the fix over the next few years. General Brown, is that your sort of approach, and do you support that? That again, we're careful here not to just sort of accept a half-baked result. We want to get what the taxpayer paid for, but nonetheless, we've got to move forward.
I am. And the aspect right now with the KC-40, it does have capability to refuel a good portion of our fleet, not only the Air Force, but also part of the Joint Force, to move cargo, to do air medical evacuation. And we're making that capability available to Transcom. I've had several conversations with General Lyons, and we've come to agreement on how best to do this. It's also helpful because the airmen that are actually operating our KC-10 and KC-135s today are the same airmen. They're going to have to operate the KC-46, operate and maintain the KC-46 when it comes off the line. And we've got to make a transition to be able to train that manpower, those airmen, to ensure that we can, as the KC-46 continues to develop its capabilities, we'll have them available to be able to continue to execute as the KC-46 gains its capability.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Again, it was clear to all of us, though, who took a ride a few months ago, and there was about a dozen or so House members and senators. I mean, in a contested environment, though, that it's still not ready for prime time until we get the hardware fixed. So again, it sounds like you found sort of a happy medium in terms of utilization, and but we are going to be tracking very closely because, as I mentioned, we've been very involved in this. Secondly, on the C-130s, we in the last NDAA put a floor in terms of the size of the fleet at 287 C-130s. Again, there was a little bit of heartburn, I know, from the Air Force when that was done. However, we wanted to see what the mobility capability requirement study, which has been ongoing in terms of airlift, was going to come back with. We've gotten sort of it's a late-breaking development, literally within the last 24 hours or so, but it does seem to validate that the O plans and all of the studies show that we do need to have a fleet at roughly that same number, and we look forward to working with you and your staff as that report gets digested. I know there was a discussion before this morning's hearing, and again, we'll sort of leave it at that for now. And lastly, on the B-1 bombers, General Nahom was over at the subcommittee on June 8th, and he testified that, quote, until these units, in other words, the B-21s, shake hands with the B-1s, we have no intention of going below 45 in terms of the fleet, because the combatant commanders need that firepower in the next 5, 7, 10 years until the B-21s start showing up in the numbers we need. So I just want to confirm his testimony that we're not going to be retiring B-1s to get and dip below that 45 sort of minimum requirement. And again, if you could just speak to that.
That is accurate, and that's my intent, not only on bombers, but other capabilities as well, is to make sure we have a good transition between the capabilities we have today and the capabilities we have for the future, and minimize the risk to our combatant commanders and today's requirements.
Thank you. Again, as I said, this has been an area also where Congress has been very involved, and we have a very compressed schedule, as has been said before, in terms of markup. So we look forward to working with you and your staff. And with that, I yield back.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Secretary Roth, I'd like to go to you. Listen, I'm exacerbated. Here we are with an aircraft that should have been delivered as a working aircraft. That is the KC-46A. and we're paying $226 million a copy for a lemon. Every month we hear another Category 1 deficiency, and we're being told, oh, don't worry about it, it has some utility. It can fly. Well, you know, there's not much other than that it has a utility for. And I am really frustrated because early on we said, why are you accepting aircraft that have these multiple deficiencies, that can't do the mission? And now you have an additional cost of keeping other aircraft that you wanted to retire in the fleet. Listen, the platform's broken. I think the program is irreparable, and the underlying cause is a bad contract. Now we learn that our FMS partners are being upcharged up to 1,500% for spare parts. That's just unbelievable. And I find myself asking these questions continually. And I have a question for you. This is a bad contract. Have you thought about recompeting this contract when this contract ends, the current contract ends? Or have you thought about recompeting it this year? Something has got to give on this. We have a number of aircraft that are sitting on the tarmac that aren't even being flown. And we talk about air crews, we talk about, oh gosh, you know, we're going to get it there. I keep getting promises after promises after promises. And we have tarmacs full of aircraft. And I understand you got to train airmen and move them on to the next platform, but this aircraft is not fully mission capable. It's time that something changes. Acting Secretary Roth, what are your thoughts?
We need to work on the KC-46 and make it the airplane.
No, you don't need to work on it. You need to get it. You need to get it to the point where it's functional,
Yeah.
fully functional.
Well, again, and we agree, and we've been working with the contractor as was responded to before. We're going to work on the remote visual system. We're going to work on the boom, and hopefully they'll be ready by FY23 or FY24. At this point, we don't see either the economic or business sense of recompeting the contract. We do think it's a good idea to keep accepting aircraft such as they are. They can do a bit more than I think you give that credit for. And we're going to use the KC-46 as a node and as we work out some of the ABMS technology and the like. So our sense is the best. I'm sorry. Okay.
Listen, with all due respect, you say it can do a little bit more than we say it can do. We look at Category 1 deficiencies. It can't hold fuel. It's supposed to be a tanker. You have human waste on board that it can't seem to hold. You know, the aircraft is full of foreign object debris when it's being manufactured. Those seem like pretty significant things to me. The description of the aircraft as a tanker and it can't hold fuel, I'm not sure where you see the utility in saying that this is an aircraft. Yes, it can fly, you can put people in it, but I would argue that a lot of other aircraft out there that can do the same thing. At some point, I think you have to take decisive action for this. Let me move on to another question while I still have some time left. I want to get to also what our FMS partners are being charged for spare parts and potentially what we're paying for spare parts. It seems as though this is becoming a check writer for Boeing on a bad contract. 1,500% upcharge on spare parts. Is this true? And if so, why? And what are we doing about that? That's another element of this that I think is highly problematic.
I need to get back. I don't have all the details on that, so I take your point for the time being. As I understand, the customer, in this case Japan, wanted a contract very quickly. We provided it to them, and they're relatively satisfied. But that said, let me go back and check the facts. Our folks in the acquisition community are taking a look at what actually played out, and we owe you an answer on what exactly happened.
Going back to the contract, it just doesn't seem like to me that the contract in its current state is good for the Air Force. And I would argue Boeing should be looking at that and say it's not good for Boeing. They've lost over $5 billion with this contract. It seems like under those circumstances, it would make sense to look at recompeting the contract. Doesn't seem like anybody in this contract is getting what they need.
I take your point. Right now, our business sense is that recompeting it would not, in fact, be a good move. But we'll take your point under consideration and go forward. Right now, we think the best thing to do is to try to execute the program as best as possible and fix it. I take your point.
I would strongly urge you to look at recompeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
I was hoping that Mr. Turner was here and why he has made an assault on Christmas, his opening comment at all these hearings. The war on Christmas, Mr. Turner, please. Moving on, General Brown, you've requested $2.6 billion for the GBSD in fiscal year 22. The Air Force estimates that we'll spend well over $85 billion in the next decade on this system. I suspect that that's probably low given the history of all of these major platforms. With this price tag continuing to rise over the next decade, what trade-offs is the Air Force making in the relatively flat budget environment that we have? Perhaps weapons sustainment systems, so that perhaps the F-35 can be more than 54% fully mission capable? What trade-offs are you making so that you can fund the GBSD?
As far as the trade-offs, it's really across our budget. We'll have to make adjustments to ensure to fully fund the nuclear modernization. And so, because the nuclear modernization and the triad is really the rock foundation of our deterrent that supports every one of our old plans, supports and allows us to be able to execute conventionally. And so there will be a balance between not only our nuclear, but also some other conventional capabilities. I don't have specifics I can give to you to say, to be able to tie one to the other, but as we look across the entire budget, that's where we have to look and how we balance.
Okay, so the GBSD is your top priority, and the ability of the F-35 to actually fly more than 54% of the time fully mission capable is not a priority?
The mission capability of the F-35 is also a priority. And, you can try to connect the two together, but I think it's a fuller aspect of across the entire United States Air Force that I look at. The F-35 is an important program to us as well, just like our nuclear portfolio is.
So you're satisfied with the F-35 at 54% mission capable, and you're not going to put any more money into it? Instead, you're going to fund the GBSD?
I'm not satisfied with 54%, and in fact, I think it's a bit higher than 54%. And so our balance here is to be able to put not only into our nuclear portfolio, but also I'm focused on sustainment with the F-35 to increase its mission capability. I've had direct engagements with the CEO of Lockheed Martin on several occasions, as well as work with the Joint Program Office to increase its capability. But it's really the aspect of us working together, not only internal to the Air Force, but with the Joint Program Office and with our industry partner.
Well, in 2020, which was just 5 months ago, that entire year, full mission capability, 54%. Well, if you're satisfied with that, then fund the GBSD. Don't take any money out of the GBSD to buy perhaps more engines. I'll let that just hang there. You have a new warhead for the GBSD. Is that correct?
We do.
Could you describe the process of the development of that new warhead, which I believe is the 87-1? How's that going?
For everything I understand, it's going well, but it's not only with the internal to the Air Force, but it's also working with DOE on that warhead as well.
Well, indeed, you're correct. It is the DOE, but they said in testimony just this week that they will not be able to develop the W-87-1 pits until well into the 2035 decade. So it won't be available as you develop the GBSD, as you intend to deploy the GBSD. So what warhead are you putting on the GBSD, since the 87-1 will not be available at any time during your deployment period, that is to 36?
Well, I've not been privy or been told about the particular issues with the warhead. And I'll have to get back with you on the specifics.
Well, presumably the GBSD was specifically designed for a new warhead. The new warhead will not be available during the implementation of the GBSD, that is until 36 and beyond. Are you aware of the additional cost that the NNSA is planning for the development of the pits?
I'm not aware of the cost.
And
well,
sadly, the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
So you have to continue, sir. Sorry. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Roth, General Brown, I want to first thank you again for your visit to Robins Air Force Base and your commitment to Robins Air Force Base, the home of ABMS. And I know that the President's budget has called for the drawdown of 4 J-stars. That is something that that I am supportive of based on the advancements in ABMS and the Air Force's commitment to the men and women at Robins and the Georgia Air National Guard. Could you briefly discuss some of the advancements of the ABMS program? And the department has called for, in the fiscal year 22 budget request, $204 million in research and development for the ABMS program. Could you speak to that issue, please, sir? Either one.
So the investment on ABMS is really aspects of building out parts of the digital infrastructure to be able to connect and move information for ABMS. So that's one part. The other part that's specific to the capability with the J-stars is the ground moving target indicator. And that's the aspect we're working at, a space-based capability, working very closely with the Space Force on bringing that capability together to be able to help provide additional ISR capability from other means from what we do today traditionally. And so it's also, one key aspect of it is building out the digital infrastructure so we can actually move the information that comes from our various platforms and to include our ISR.
And so General Raymond, do you feel, are you comfortable that as they pull down the J-stars that the GMTI capability will be there from space so that our combatant commanders have that capability?
Yes, sir, I am. That program, two things with that program. First, it has recently come over to the Space Force. Secondly, the very first thing that we did was reduce the classification of it so we can talk about it, so we can integrate it better with commercial industry, we can integrate better with our intelligence partners. Our goal is to build a system and design a system that takes advantage of both of those partners, and I'm comfortable where I sit today that we'll be able to do that and deliver on time for the J-stars replacement.
I'm absolutely convinced that it has to happen and it has to work. Our enemies have systems that their weapons are significantly faster than they were when our current systems were developed, and they're more powerful than they were. And they're also smaller, and that makes them harder to pick up. And it means we've got to pick them up further away if we're going to intercept them before they do damage to Americans at home or our interests abroad. And so I don't have any further questions other than Secretary Roth, I appreciate your service and your time at Robins Air Force Base. Enjoyed that with you. And gentlemen, I appreciate your service. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Norcross is recognized.
Thank you. Appreciate you all being here today. General Brown, much being said about the 4+1, and one of the key components is the F-35. Yet in the unfunded priority budget, you did not list any additional F-35As this year, which is a noted exception going past the last few years. Why not, yet you included in the unfunded list the power modules and additional parts? Would you explain why that decision was made?
Sure, Representative Norcross. What I look at, and one of the things we've talked about with members of this committee and others, is the sustainment on the F-35. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect of this is that the F-35 we have today is not necessarily the F-35 we want to have that goes into the future, that will have Check Refresh 3 and Block 4 against particularly advancing Chinese threat. And so I'm balancing between additional F-35s, driving down our average fleet, or age of our fleet with F-15EXs, but also focus on sustainment. And so it's a balance there between the F-35s that we already have in the budget, which even with the unfunded priority list, the majority of the new fighters we're going to buy are going to be F-35s. But I wanted to put also some focus on sustainment as well, because we've talked about that quite often. That's the rationale behind the F-15EXs on the budget, on the UPL, not F-35s, but F-35 sustainment.
Thank you. Continuing the 4+1, and we're looking at NGAD, which there's a considerable amount of money going towards that. And in the past, Air Force has said time and time again they want to get away from that single role fighter. To the degree you can in this environment, can you tell us, are you looking at NGAD as a single or multi-role platform?
Ideally, I'd like to have it to be multi-role, but the primary aspect for NGAD is air superiority. And with air superiority, it's an increased weapons load, it's increased range, particularly when you look at operating in the Indo-Pacific and against the threat we expect to see in the Indo-Pacific. So to the future, what I really look at for all of our fighters is to have multi-role capability, to be able to go from a high-end conflict all the way down to homeland defense, and that drives a combination capability. But really, NGAD's really focused more so on a highly contested environment, to have the weapons load, both air-to-air primarily, but some air-to-ground capability to ensure one, it can survive, but also provide options for our component commanders and for the Joint Force.
Thank you. Just to shift back to the KC-46, and much has been said over the course of the several years on the contract being a problem. But on the KC-46 and the contract with Boeing now, the mistakes that are being made are on the dime of Boeing versus on us, as most other contracts. Is that correct?
That is correct, particularly for the remote visual system. The Air Force has some responsibility for the stiff boom.
And the one we agreed to, the remote visual system, is now, quite frankly, as everybody's talked about, is unmatched in the world in terms of its advanced stage of what it can do, correct?
That is correct, and we've done some outstanding work with not only our engineers, Air Force engineers, but also with Boeing engineers and others that have provided some advice on how best to move forward.
It was not pleasant getting here, and we have now the newest and best system in the world. And I don't think anybody will talk about making up the time, but to retrofit a KC-46 to the new visual system versus going out and try to get a brand new fighter, the time doesn't even come close, does it?
It doesn't.
Okay. So here we are. We ran the race. We're right at the finish line, and somehow to look at this again seems to me to be insane. And certainly, I have great respect for the folks on the other side of the aisle on this one. But I didn't hear about putting this out for a new contract in the last 4 years, and I'm hearing it now. We are so close to the end that I think this would be a grave mistake to do this. Beyond the contract, that's something new, especially if we held this high of a standard for all the other platforms that just in here today, we would have nothing out on the road. And with that, Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Norcross, thank you. Mr. Kelly, I believe you're up. Excuse me, Mr. Kelly. Stefanik, Desjardins, are they on the screen? Okay, Mr. Kelly, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service and for being here. I'm not a bean counter, but I do know how to count beans. And as a member of the Budget Committee also, I'm deeply concerned in what my view is deep cuts to our DoD budget this year. And we rely on your leadership and your advice to the administration to inform them of what our required needs are to be ready to fight tonight and also fight the fights of the future. I don't want to go back to planes falling out of the air, airmen dying, to ships crashing into each other, and to those things. So I just ask that you guys, if you need something, please stand up and ask. We cannot take these haircuts and 2 years from now pay for that in readiness, which means service members dying. And that is our obligation, to protect the men and women who serve in our uniforms at all costs, regardless of party or affiliation. That being said, as you're aware, Columbus Air Force Base in my district trains a great many prospective Air Force pilots each year. The 48 T-1A aircraft at Columbus Air Force Base provide prospective pilots with real-world flying experience. While the T-1 has a service life of 2050, and $67.2 million has been spent on upgrades, we've heard the Air Force was considering retiring this fleet in 2023. I've been told this decision resided with the Secretary of the Air Force, and to date, a final decision has not been made. However, upon reviewing the Air Force's FY22 budget, where funds are provided for more upgrades to the T-1A, it also states that retirements will begin in 2023. Can you please explain where the Air Force is exactly on the T-1A retirement decision?
Yeah, let me defer to General Brown because I'm actually not up to speed on this.
So on the, we've actually had conversations back and forth about the T1, where we need to go as far as whether we retire or not. And this is part of our discussion on some of the initiatives we have associated with pilot training next and others. And so I would tell you, Mr. Kelly, that we have not made a final decision one way or another, and that's part of the analysis that's still ongoing.
Thank you, General Brown. And it's my understanding that the Air Force believes new simulation technology will require less actual cockpit time in the future, but most of this technology has yet to be implemented. Do you believe it's wise to retire a training aircraft with over 25 years of service life left prior to confirming the simulation technology will be as good as real-world flying? And again, this comes to airmen or pilots' lives.
And that is part of the ongoing analysis, and then kind of balancing that between the capability and the technology we have to do today's simulation, at the same time balancing it off against the cost of modernization for the T1 and some of the other aspects. But I'm 100% with you that we want to make sure our pilots and across our force are well trained, and we don't put them at risk.
And I would appreciate if the Air Force would provide me with this committee, their analysis and finding as it pertains to the retirement of the T1. I'm concerned with the speed at which we're moving on this. And I go back just a little further. General Brown, right now we have a real issue retaining pilots in the Air Force. I'm not a pilot, but I do know that most men and women who join the Air Force fly to, especially in the fighter realm, they join to fly. And if we're putting them in simulators instead of aircraft, what that means is they're going to go fly an aircraft for a commercial airline, which we already have a hard time competing with. So I just ask that you guys do that. General Raymond, in short, feel like we've left you out today, and I think you are one of the most important. Well, I was a real proponent for creating you guys. What needs do you have to make sure that our Space Force gives us the great competitive advantage against our near-peer adversaries? What can we do in Congress budget-wise to help you with that, General Raymond?
Well, I appreciate your support, and I've appreciated it for years, and I thank you. As I mentioned, we're trying to balance four priorities. We have critical capabilities that fuel our American way of war and our American way of life that are not easily defendable. We have to make that shift. And so as we come in with the analysis that shows how we plan to do that, we're going to need your support because it's critical to us. We have a design that is purpose-built for a domain that we don't operate in today, and we've got to make a shift, and we've got to do it quick.
Thank you. And my final point, I'm an Army guy, and I do not we think we need to divest in our Army platform, although I do think the Air Force needs more right now, and also the Navy. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to lay out the gavel order. Members are coming and going for multiple reasons. On the Democratic side, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Moulton, you're up. And then on the Republican side, we have Mr. Desjardins, who has returned, followed by Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I refer and yield to my good friend from Hawaii, who's going to let me stay at his place a couple times for a question.
Mahalo, Mr. Gallego, and thank you so much for coming today to testify. I'm going to piggyback off of Mr. Kelly's question. As a proud graduate of Columbus Air Force Base, to General Brown, in terms of the pilot shortage that you discussed in your testimony and the inability to properly address that. You talked about production and retention, and I want to focus on the production piece. What has the Air Force done or is looking at to address that pilot shortage? We know for a fact the commercial airlines are heavily recruiting our military pilots. There's a pilot shortage in the commercial U.S. domestic airline fleet, and they're going to continue to pool Air National Guard and reserves and active duty pilots from our forces. Are we looking at other ways to raise the age for UPT candidates, to increase more applicants to the United States Air Force Academy, to recruit more from our ROTC campuses throughout the country? What are we doing to address that pilot shortage so we have pilots to fly these aircraft in the future?
Well, there's several initiatives that we have ongoing that are tied to introducing young people to aviation much earlier in high school, junior high school, through junior ROTC, Civil Air Patrol, and summer programs to create that interest. Once we've got their attention, part of that is also the techniques we use in different initiatives, different from the way I went to pilot training. And I recall when I went to pilot training, if you were doing well and you were going too fast, you sat down. But by being more individually focused and using it, some of our virtual reality and other technologies to increase our throughput, but at the same time, ensure we have the right level of quality. And that's the thing I'm proud of, the quality of the young people that we were getting into our Air Force. On the retention side, it's not only the flying aspect, but it's how we take care of their airmen and their families. Because often it's not just the member who loves flying, but they also, particularly if they have a family, to make sure their spouse and their children have those resources. So it's a combination of things that we have to do as an Air Force, not only to produce, but also to retain that talent, not only in the Air Force, but also in the total force.
Are we seeing at the UPT bases across the country, because of the pilot shortage, that we're not flying or we're not teaching enough students, we're not flying enough airplanes, and to sustain the 4 or 5 UPT bases that we have, that's the appropriate level that we have right now for training?
You know, what I would tell you is that, as I kind of described, you know, in FY19, in the numbers we had in FY20, particularly during the height of COVID, we were pretty much equal. And COVID actually had us slow down a bit. And as we come into FY21 and continue, we're starting to see our numbers increase. I think we are on a good path based on not only just the production initiatives we have today, but the additional initiatives we have on pilot training next, UPT 2.5, also with our civilian sim instructor locality pay, allows more of our service members to actually get in the cockpit and fly a bit more, while we have more sim instructors and not having them doing the sim. So we have several initiatives ongoing to help increase our throughput to get to the 1,500 a year, which is our goal.
Okay, great. And last question is for the Space Force. General Raymond, the Maui Space Situational Awareness Lab over on Maui, critical facility, and they're looking at expanding the tech park there, building a new facility that will support test, integration, prototyping for electrical, optical sensors, and remote control of those telescopes on Haleakala. Can you share the status of the Maui Space Situational Awareness Lab?
Well, first of all, that's a very important lab and a very important capability. One of the great things when we stood up the Space Force, we also have an operational squadron on top of that mountain, and they didn't talk to each other. And now that we put everybody under the Space Force, we've consolidated them. We're going to consolidate them in one unit. So we'll be able to develop the technology, hand it over to operators, and be able to generate capability much quicker. That facility that you're talking about is going through a design review by the Army Corps of Engineers. I think they just completed the last November a 35% design review. There's an environmental assessment going on as we speak that's supposed to finalize this November, and then we'll have to secure funding for it. It's currently unfunded.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'll yield back. Mahalo.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Roth, in your posture statement, you indicate that the Air Force is investing heavily in hypersonic weapon systems, and I would like to focus on the testing and evaluation of these systems and the infrastructure that supports this testing. In order to field these weapon systems, we need to test them and ensure that they actually work. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record the Department of Air Force's 2021 assessment of the Air Force Test Center. Mr. Roth, in this report, you indicate that the current testing capability and capacity available is wholly inadequate to accomplish National Defense Strategy required hypersonic weapon testing to meet rapid acquisition timelines. What are we doing to address this testing shortfall?
I'll have to get back to you with a little more details, but we work with our OSD partners as best we can to try to keep up with the test and evaluation infrastructure. To be honest, it's my experience we always lag by some amount of money. So we need to get after it. In order to be able to test the hypersonics, we need the capabilities to exercise them to their maximum extent possible. So we'll look into that, and I'll get you a more fulsome answer for the record.
Well, as you may know, my district is home to the Arnold Engineering Development Complex, where much of the testing takes place. I've seen the poor condition of these facilities firsthand, and as I understand it, if some of these facilities like 16S, 16T, or Tunnel 9 were to go offline due to mechanical failure, we would see many of our most important emerging weapon systems delayed, including the B-21, NGI, GBSD, and our hypersonic systems. Are you personally concerned about the condition of our aging and rundown testing infrastructure?
Short answer is yes.
Can you just put a fine point on how important it is that we modernize these facilities in the context of meeting the goals laid out in the National Defense Strategy?
Again, I mean, if we're going to go to high-tech capabilities, we're going to go to 5th generation, 6th generation aircraft, hypersonics, and the like. We need to be able to test them.
And yeah, I share your concern, obviously, and the folks at Arnold have been sounding the alarms on this issue for years now and are making the best of an awful situation where they are understaffed and under-resourced. I think they are being failed. A lot of people pay lip service to the importance of fielding hypersonic weapon systems as our top priority, and if that is truly the case, then we need to invest in our testing infrastructure to resolve this bottleneck and fortify our critical testing facilities. I believe the Department of Defense needs to be doing more, and we on this committee need to be doing more as well. I hope that we can continue this dialogue and that you can provide this committee with the path forward to address these issues. I will also be submitting some questions for the record on FSRM funding at Arnold and look forward to your responses on that. And you know, for anyone who hasn't visited there, it's a gem. There's really nothing like it in the United States, maybe a similar facility in Europe, but it's almost a one-of-a-kind in this country, and some of the architecture and facilities have been working the same for 50, 60 years. It's impressive to see how almost archaic some of it looks in terms of the machinery and how the wind tunnels work. But I think it's really essential that we get these upgraded because, again, everybody talks hypersonic, hypersonic, but it all starts on the ground. If it doesn't work on the ground, it ain't going to work in the air. So thanks for your attention to this matter, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gavel order on the Democratic side is Moulton, Carbajal, Brown. On the Republican side, Gallagher, Bacon, Cheney. We now turn to Mr. Moulton. He's not here. Mr. Carbajal, you are here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Acting Secretary Roth and General Raymond, this committee has engaged with the department many times regarding the development of a Space National Guard and Reserve component. Hundreds of guardsmen in California operate space missions for the Air Force and the Army. In my district at Vandenberg Space Force Base, there are 2 critical CalGuard squadrons with space missions. From my understanding, Air Force and Space Force leadership are in agreement in the path forward on establishing a Space National Guard, but yet no proposal has been submitted to Congress yet. When do you intend to submit the report required in the fiscal year 2021 NDAA and send over the necessary legislative changes for the fiscal year 22 NDAA?
I'll start the answer, and General Raymond can fill in some blanks as well. We're still working it with our leadership in the Office of Secretary of Defense and ultimately with the Office of Management and Budget as well. So it's been an active topic. We concur with you. We're working it as best we can, and it's just a matter of trying to get people's time focused on it, and as soon as we get some clearance, if we get the clearance from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, we would be forwarding it. I don't know if General Raymond, you want to?
We've been operating with the Guard for 25 years. It provides critical capability, both people-wise and equipment-wise. We can't do our job without them today, and we can't do our job in the future without them. So what the law said when we stood up the Space Force was, might you do it a better way that could even increase our ability to use those capabilities. We've done the report. It's complete. It's all through coordination. It's waiting for a final briefing. Once approved, it'll get submitted to OMB to get submitted to Congress. I think we're very close to getting that submitted.
Thank you. General Raymond, I appreciate your leadership in developing the range of the future plan to invest in our launch capabilities. Can you provide additional insight into how the fiscal year 22 Space Force budget is supporting the range of the future concept? What aspects of your plan will be the most difficult to accomplish?
The range of the future is vital to us to increase the transaction rates and get more things launched into space. We're launching almost on almost a weekly basis, not quite that, but the launch rates that we're seeing at both across our nation are high. We have got to reduce the bureaucracy of the range. We have to flatten the range. We have to make it more digital, and we've got that funded, and we've got the architecture agreed to, and you're seeing that in throughput through the ranges that's pretty remarkable. We are leading the world in launch, and it's vital to us as we move forward.
Thank you. I appreciated your and Secretary Roth's insight that you provided us upon our visit to Cape Canaveral a few weeks ago, so thank you very much for that. General Raymond, to conclude, one of the major focuses of the Space Force was ensuring that space systems can be developed and acquired at the speed of innovation. What are your perspectives on how to fix the space system's unique acquisition challenges?
Yeah, we're working that really hard. We have to go faster. We have to go faster, and that's been our focus. With the help of this committee, we stood up a Space Rapid Capabilities Office. They're just 2 years old, and they are already delivering at speed. In fact, the Space and Missile Systems Center has been re-architected. I gave them a challenge less than a year ago to build a space domain awareness capability and develop it in tactical timelines and be responsive in its launch. In less than a year, they built the satellite, we put it on a shelf, and we gave them We gave them a 21-day call-up, and they just launched it successfully yesterday. We have to drive unity of effort across the department. We have to reduce duplication. We have to reduce costs, and we have to push authority down to the lower level to be able to move at speed.
Thank you, General. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher is recognized.
Thank you. General Brown, do you share the assessment recently expressed by Admiral Davidson about a potential PRC action against Taiwan within the next 6 years?
I don't know if I'd characterize it the same way Admiral Davidson would, but I do believe that we are at risk in the next 6 years, in the next decade, that to see that PRC may have the capability. One of my goals as the Air Force Chief and as one of the Joint Chiefs is to ensure we have the capability to deter any type of action like that in the next 6 years, and really for the long term as well.
Deterrence, I think, is the key word there. So if you were to make the case in simple terms that this budget advances us down the field in the direction of a deterrence by denial posture, not by punishment posture, in the Indo-Pacific, what would you highlight as far as what we're doing in order to deter by denial on a 5-year time frame, not a 2-decade time frame?
One of the areas that particularly the PRC looks at is how they use information. And for us, how we use information as well, and this is why the importance of advanced battle management system, to be able to move data to drive decision-making so we can stay one step ahead of our adversary. It's not only what we do from a Department of Defense aspect, but it's what we do as a nation to understand the environment, the dynamics, and how we're able to use our military capability to sow a bit of doubt into our adversaries. So the day they decide to do something, it's not going to be that day based on the capabilities we presented and the information we understand and how we move and react, and really more be proactive in our approach.
But in terms of, I mean, aircraft and sort of physical kinetic things, I'd be curious to expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. Well, really on the kinetic things, for our weapons aspect, instead of investing in the preferred weapons that we've been using for the past 5, 10, 15 years, is shifting that investment into different weapons capability, hypersonics, JASM, LRASM, LRSO on the nuclear side, moving forward and putting more RTD&E into those type of capabilities versus the capabilities that we've used today that will not be as effective in the future.
I think LRASM is critical. Just quickly on that, when do you anticipate the B-52 will be LRASM capable?
I don't have those specifics here in front of me, but I'll get those back to you.
So how has the end of a continuous bomber presence in Guam impacted Air Force bomber presence in the Indo-Pacific theater more broadly? Has it stayed flat? Has it gone up? Has it gone down?
It's provided options, and I will tell you, I was the Indo-PACOM Air Component Commander when that decision was made, and as we now have more flexibility with our Bomber Task Force and our CONUS-to-CONUS missions. And so what we end up doing is about 3 times a quarter, we'll do a Bomber Task Force for anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks at different locations across the Indo-Pacific, as well as 3 to 4 CONUS-to-CONUS missions internal to Indo-PACOM. That also provides flexibility for the other combatant commands, and it also provides us an opportunity to go to locations we don't traditionally go to. For example, we had a bomber in India just this year, for the first time we've had a bomber in India since World War II. Wow. And it's aspects like that to provide us a bit more flexibility as an Air Force. It also helps increase our readiness as an Air Force as well.
So has bomber presence increased in other combatant commands now that the assets are no longer tied to Guam?
It gives us more flexibility to be able to, the way I would describe it is that we have more flexibility to not have all of our capability in just one location. Our adversaries have to be thinking about the aspects that we can move our capability anytime, anywhere, very quickly, and that's one aspect that I'm very proud of what the United States Air Force provides.
Are there any basing and infrastructure needs in Indo-PACOM that are going unaddressed in this year's budget?
Well, from a MILCON perspective, there's some things that we I have to get you some more details, but just based on the look at how we invest in infrastructure for weapon storage, for airfield improvements as well, are key areas that we want to continue to work on to provide us options to be able to operate in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, well, I'd love to follow up with you on that and a couple of other questions. And I remain preoccupied with what I'm now calling the Davidson window and how we can plan on that narrower time horizon, that shorter time horizon, rather than a 2-decade time horizon. And so I look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hosting this important briefing. I want to thank Secretary Roth, General Raymond, and General Brown for being here today. There's been a lot of conversation around strategy and structure and platforms and programs. I want to focus my questions on people, our airmen and guardians. Secretary Roth, the fiscal year 21 NDAA included many provisions that promote greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in the department, in the services, and those provisions enjoyed broad bipartisan support. So I just wanted to ask you the status of some of those provisions. One was that we directed each military service to ensure that its promotion boards represent the diversity of its force. So can you share with us how the Air Force has implemented that requirement, and if it has not, what is the plan to do so?
Well, we have in fact taken the guidance from both the Authorization Act, and we actually had initiatives that were ongoing before that to address exactly the kinds of concerns that you're alluding to. So first and foremost, let me begin by what we took a diversity and inclusion task force and have institutionalized it. Part of what the Authorization Act called for was a senior advisor, and so we now have an Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the head of that office is a direct report to me, to the Secretary as well. We've also increased the training for everybody who's involved in the process, everything from selection panels to promotion panels and the like, to ensure that folks are taking a broader view in terms of how they address both promotions and performance reviews and this type of thing. We have a barrier analysis working group that looks at the kinds of things that might be barriers and any anomalies that might be holding us back. And what we're doing is taking a very data-driven approach to these kinds of things. We are doing climate surveys. We have something called DEOCS, the Defense Equal Opportunity Climate Survey, and other like kinds of things to give us some information on exactly how we're doing and where the kinds of issues and problems might be. So we're taking a hard look at climate. We're taking a hard look at promotions, as you allude to. We're taking a hard look at how we manage the force. across the board. So we have actually, in preparing for the hearing, there was the list of all the NDA requirements, and for each one of those, we have an initiative ongoing to implement them.
Well, I appreciate that, and I also do want to commend the Air Force. I have not looked at the Space Force on this issue, although since it is at the service level, the Air Force is the service that that covers both the Air Force and the Space Force. I commend you for establishing that office and appointing the senior advisor. The Air Force Inspector General found in its independent racial disparity review that Black airmen are 72% more likely to receive Article 15 non-judicial punishment and are 57% more likely to be referred to court-martial. And moreover, it found that young Black airmen are twice as likely to be involuntarily discharged. It's not the inviting environment, I think, that that reflects our values and what we should expect of the Air Force, Space Force. I've said the same thing, the Army, Navy, and the Marines. What is the Air Force doing to address some of these racially disparate treatments that we're seeing under the UCMJ and administrative procedures?
Well, it's a point well taken. We're familiar with the data and the information that you outlined. We actually have a command justice climate tool that we're using to get after that, again, as part of our overall effort to have a data-driven approach to this. So it probably should have been one of the areas I highlighted when I went through my quick summary, but we're also taking a hard look at our judicial and legal processes as well and trying to incorporate to see where we need to change our approach to those.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'm actually glad you didn't include it in the quick summary because, given what we're seeing under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and administrative procedures, I mean, Black and brown airmen are not being treated the way that they ought to be. So I do commend the Air Force for taking a look and certainly want to see the movement in the metrics and the numbers to support that you are committed to making some change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Mr. Roth for being here. And it's great to see General Brown and General Raymond, who I served with in multiple assignments in various capacities, and you guys are doing a great job. I want to make a statement about pass-through funding, which the Air Force has straddled with, and then a couple questions. But first on the pass-through funding, both services here have vital missions. You have 2 of the 3 legs of the nuclear triad: strategic warning, air and space mobility, ISR, and most importantly, the ability to hold any target on Earth at risk within hours or minutes. And this is why you exist. The reason why this committee exists is to ensure that the limited dollars the nation invests in national defense are put to the best possible use. This necessarily involves tough decisions, relies on clear and transparent budget information on where this money is going. So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note for my colleagues that the FY22 budget request states that the top line request for the Department of Air Force is $212 billion. What DoD's budget does not reveal is that $39 billion of that, of the Air Force top line, 18%, in fact, is not actually controlled by the Department of the Air Force, which means it neither implements nor advances the force design and operational readiness needs of our air and space forces. So when you subtract that non-blue amount from the Air Force top line, the actual top line is closer to $173 billion. So I submit that this is a Cold War era pass-through budgeting practice, and I think it distorts the public's understanding of our defense investments in air, land, sea, and space. I would guess that most members of the committee aren't even aware of this budgeting practice. I just think it's wrong. Now more than at any time in our history, every defense dollar must deliver maximum deterrent value, and for this reason we need to have absolute clarity and transparency. So last year, this committee and our colleagues in the Senate both raised this pass-through budgeting process as a concern, and we tasked the Department of Defense to find a better way. So the Department of Defense still owes the committee an answer on how to clean this up, and we're still waiting to hear how they plan to do it. So with that, my first question here is for General Brown. The budget request seeks to retire the E-8 Joint Stars along with some of the RQ-4s. Can you tell us how the Air Force plans to ensure ISR requirements are met while you retire a significant portion of the ISR fleet?
I appreciate the question, and I would really characterize it as a small portion of the ISR fleet as we move forward, J-Stars and the RQ-4. What we require for the future, not only for what we see today, but also what we require for the future is a ISR capability that is connected, persistent, and survivable. Right now, I have something that's very persistent, less connected, and less survivable. And so for us as an Air Force is to be able to transition to that greater capability we're going to require in the future. An aspect of that is a dialogue I have with the combatant commanders, and I've talked to every single one of the combatant commanders before they testified about where the Air Force is headed and how we will actually do our best to help mitigate an incredible demand signal for ISR from the combatant commands and the capabilities the United States Air Force provides, and in concert really with the Space Force as well, because the department does the lion's share of the ISR for the joint.
Right. Going to the MQ-9 and a related question, you're going to stop procurement on the MQ-9. With such a large number of MQ-9s retiring each year due to reaching their maximum flight hour limits, how does the Air Force plan to keep this high-demand fleet viable until we can bridge to a new capability?
Yeah, so one aspect with the MQ-9 is again, a very popular platform, particularly in an uncontested environment. Based on previous budget cycles, we will still have MQ-9s coming into our inventory into FY25, FY24. So less on, not so much retirement, we are really going to stop some level of procurement. The other aspect is our transition to a future capability as well. At the same time, modernizing the remaining of the MQ-9 fleet with a multi-domain operation capability that will have the MQ-9s well into the next decade, really to about 2035 or so.
Thank you. I want to segue to electronic warfare for a moment, but we only have about 40 seconds left. I appreciate General Brown's comments that the Air Force has been asleep at the wheel for about 3 or 4 decades in this area. For both the air and the space side, do you plan on submitting a electronic magnetic spectrum operations strategy or implementation plan?
Well, we actually, really under the Department of the Air Force, we actually have a strategy that was published in April, and our implementation plan for both services will be published here in the fall.
Thank you. I think it's important that we catch back up with where the Chinese are at. And I'll just close with a comment, since we don't have time for a question. I know how important Block 4 on the F-35 is. I hope you keep the pressure on the JPO and the other committees there to get this fielded on time. I know how much we need it.
Gentleman's
Thank
time
you.
has expired. Ms. Houlihan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm assuming that I can be heard, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I serve on the Military Personnel Subcommittee, where we've been closely examining the allegations surrounding substandard housing conditions in the privatized housing, including infestations of rodents and exposure to mold, and the impact that consequences has to morale and readiness. So this is really personal to me because I was a military brat myself. I moved constantly as a child and frequently lived on military housing. So my question for Secretary Roth is, in your budget material, there are 12,000 units that are assessed to be in good or fair condition according to the Facility Condition Index. And I'd like to know what fair living conditions consist of on a military installation. Are these housing units for enlisted or for officers, do you know? And have you done an evaluation of who is experiencing more maintenance and more poor housing conditions? So how are you addressing this sort of discrepancy?
Well, based on the findings and the discussions we've had in the last couple of years, what we have done is increased our focus on the quality of the housing that we have. And so in each base now, we essentially have a housing, a resident advocate, a housing advocate who reports to the base commander in terms of the issues that would come up, with the members who live on base and these kinds of things. So we're working on that. We've tried to increased our focus on it and working with the contractors. We've implemented the Housing Bill of Rights out of the 18, I think, elements. We've got 14 out of the 18 that are in effect, and we're still working on negotiating with the contractors on the last 3 or 4. So it has become a priority. The Air Force Materiel Command, working with the major commands and the bases, and all have put renewed focus on that. And the short answer to your question is we plan to get after it as best we can.
And sir, there are more than 3,500 units that are considered to be poor or failing in their assessment of their condition. And so my question is, do you know, are there tenants who are asked to live in those poor or failing conditions, or have they been moved? And if they've been moved, where have they been relocated to?
Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on exactly how many moved and all. I'm not familiar with how many have moved. So we owe you that, and we'll get back to you with more details.
If it's okay, sir, I would love for you to get back to us on that, and I'll ask my next question, and maybe we could have that information provided for the record for the last one. My next question, sir, is also for you, and it has to do with STEM talent. Recruitment and retention of people is, of course, one of your priorities, and finding ways to encourage talent to remain in the Air Force is a high priority. During my time in Congress, I've been advocating for investment in STEM education and programming for children and young adults in my community to make sure that we're meeting the demands of the future workforce. Secretary Roth, as the needs of the Air Force and Space Force adapt to demand to new technical skills for recruits and airmen and guardians, how does the budget reflect meeting the needs for STEM recruitment from our high schools and colleges? Have you been looking, as an example, into the ROTC applicants from minority serving institutions to address the lack of diversity within STEM fields?
Short answer is yes. And in both services, both Air and Space Force, we value the STEM. We want a digital savvy workforce in both areas. So as an example, in the FY22 budget, we have $175 million for additional advanced degree programs to try to encourage STEM graduates who might have an interest in the Air Force. We have what we call a Premier College Intern Program as well, where we also are trying to frame a population that will serve us well. We have intern programs like Palace Acquire and Copper Cap as well that cross 20 career fields. So we are taking a focus on it. At the end of the day, we want a digital savvy workforce, both civilian and military, and so it is in fact a focus for us.
And that brings us to last year's NDAA, where we were able, my office was able to get in the Armed Forces Digital Advantage Act, which was included and established a policy to recruit, retain, and promote tech talent. Can you share what steps the Air Force and the Space Force have taken since to develop policy on tech talent management that allows us to recruit the right people for our workforce within the department?
Again, in general, to give you more, I'll have to give you more details, but in general, it has been an emphasis. It's something that we value going forward, and so we are taking a hard look at all alternatives and all options we would have along those lines.
I look forward to getting that more detail from you for the record, and I appreciate it, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. First, I just wanted to clarify something I believe Mr. Garamendi was concerned about or discussing, and that was the timing of the pit production for the GBSD warheads. Dr. Verdum has actually briefed the committee that the first pits for these warheads are going to come out of Los Alamos, and so the delays at Savannah River should in fact have no impact on the production of warheads for the GBSD. Further on the GBSD, I think this is probably one of the most bipartisan systems that we have in the United States Air Force today, approved by President Obama at the time when I think Secretary Roth, you were in the comptroller's office. It was then fully funded by President Trump. Now President Biden's requested $2.6 billion for this program in FY22. So it's a crucial program. Nice to see such bipartisan support for it and for the funding, which I think it'll be important for us to continue. As we look at the alternative of some of the life extension programs, when General Dawkins testified before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee last week, he had a figure of $38 billion that basically doing an additional life extension program on the Minuteman III would cost the taxpayers $38 billion additional dollars beyond the GBSD cost and actually produce a much less capable system. So I'd like to ask both Secretary Roth and General Brown, if you had a chance to look at those figures and if you could comment on the extent to which we're facing in fact, the ability at a much less cost to the taxpayers if we move forward on the development of the GBSD?
Well, going all the way back to when the analysis of alternatives was done back in 2014, every time we've looked at the numbers and done the analysis coming forward, the conclusion we have drawn is trying to do any kind of service life extension program for the Minuteman III will be more costly, will result in a missile that's not as capable, and with a missile that would be more expensive to maintain. To date, the GBSD has hit all its significant milestones. It is using the most modern digital engineering processes and procedures in order to go forward. It'll have first flight if the program continues on its current trajectory. It'll have first flight around FY24 and will hit the initial operating capability in FY29. It'll be a more capable, a more dependable, a safer, and more secure missile. So our inclination is to continue with the GBSD program. If we have to do a SLEP for the Minuteman III, we have to go back to square one. The industrial base doesn't support that missile yet. It'll involve an enormous amount of redesign. And our sense is you will get a less capable missile likely later than you would the GBSD.
Thank you. General Brown, do you concur with those views?
I do. Secretary Roth hit all the key points. I have nothing else to add.
Thank you. Can you advise if we were to find ourselves in the position where we had to go back and look at a SLEP, what do you see on the horizon that would be the most likely factor to cause us to have to do that? Would it be Congress refusing to appropriate the necessary funds at this point?
I don't know what the circumstances would be, but again, we think what that would result in, our responsibility, we own 2/3 of the nuclear triad. Our responsibility as a force provider and as organized, trained, and equipped is to provide a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent. And that's the path we're on. If others want to adjust that, then we'll have to have that discussion going forwards. But our sense is GBSD in this particular area is the best way forward.
Thank you very much. And I would just add, I think it's critically important for us in Congress to make sure that we are fulfilling our responsibilities and obligations, not to set us back and make sure that we continue to provide the funding necessary to move forward in this in a timely fashion. And I thank very much all the witnesses, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And General Brown, I wanted to continue on our previous conversation. I can understand why you would not want to just come out and say that we need a smaller army, but if we look at the role of Congress and the Constitution is to raise and support armies, and we currently have a very large all-volunteer army, which is a standing army. And so in the current situation we're in and the constraints on the budget with the current split within the departments, it seems as though we can only work around the edges as far as force structure is concerned. But I was referencing earlier the air-sea battle and basically a plan for that, but no one had any objections to an air-land battle, which we've used over the course of time and preparing for the Cold War and the ground conflicts that we've had over the last several decades. So it seems that construct is just blind to the current threat and the current environment we have today. And I would say that I continue to feel that both the Air Force and the Navy cannot be funded for the force structure they need and the mission using that construct. And so I wanted to go back a little bit to the things you mentioned before. You said that we do not have a continuous bomber presence in the Pacific. Notably, we obviously have ships present continuously in the Pacific. And I know that you were the PACAF commander before coming to your current role. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how we got to not having that presence in the AOR?
There were a combination of things that drove that, and part of it was the readiness impacts we were having on the bomber requirements, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also particularly in the United States Central Command. And thinking about our bombers, it's not only the conventional capability have, but it's also their nuclear responsibility as well. And it was a balance between those that drove the discussion on not having a continuous bomber presence.
And so this year, further reducing the bomber fleet is going to further exacerbate that, I would gather?
Not necessarily. And part of it, as we looked at the B-1 fleet in particular, there's an aspect of having a number of bombers that have a mission capable rate that is much lower, or having a smaller fleet of bombers where we put our energy and effort and our manpower against those to ensure they're a higher mission capable rate.
Okay.
And we've seen the improvements based on the approaches we've taken.
Well, thank you, and I would love to gather more information in a different forum about that. So some things that I think of when we think about the Pacific and we think about what strategy do we need if there's a conflict in the Pacific, some things that are game-changing are a standoff anti-ship cruise missile, like the LRASM, and the ability for mine laying from a distance, both capabilities that we touched on earlier. So it seems as though those were not things that you highlighted in this year's budget when I asked about them earlier, and you did mention LRASM, but those are game changers in the Pacific, and we say China is the focus of this budget and the efforts of this service. So just wanted to close out by saying that not having a bomber presence there, not really leaning in on these capabilities that will be game changing in the Pacific, I think that our adversaries, potential adversaries, need to know that they're continuously targeted, that we have the resources there and we have the actual, not only platforms, but weapons to do that and put them at risk. And, I don't find that present in this budget submission. It's not just that we can be there, that we can send a bomber from CONUS and we'll be there soon, but they need to know that there's a persistent threat and a persistent presence. Can you comment on the ability of this budget to meet that?
There's a combination of things that are in the budget that provide us the capability beyond just LRASM and quick strike mining is focused on maritime. I'm also focused on the ability to provide advanced weapons like JASM and JASM-ER, Arrow, which is our hypersonic munition, and we are actually, the Air Force is, I would say, leading the way on hypersonic development. The other aspect is the B-20.
Development? It's not a fielded weapon today.
It's not fielded yet. But we are leading the way, and I will tell you, and you look in competition, our adversaries are actually doing hypersonic capability at a faster rate than we are, which is why we got to pick up the pace in that. The other is our B-21, not only from a nuclear aspect, but also from a conventional aspect. And so it's a combination of those capabilities that provide us, not just in the maritime, but as you talked about air-sea battle, the combination of the capabilities between the Air Force and the Navy to be able to hold targets at risk, both in the maritime environment and other areas as well.
So just to clarify, these are not capabilities that we currently have on hand or will have at full operational capability within the next 5 to 6 years?
For Arrow, I suspect here, and I'd have to get you exact, but based on the testing we're on, I do see that within the next 5 to 6 years, we'll have hypersonic capability.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, and I yield back, and I will call on Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And General Brown, thank you, everyone, for coming today. General Brown, I certainly appreciate your expertise as the commander of Air Force Pacific, and understanding the geography and the requirements there is critical. I think it's also important that we continue to recognize, this committee continues to recognize, that we have a need for close air support for our special operations community that will remain in 60 to 70 countries on any given day that are there right now as we speak. So I appreciate your continuing the work of your predecessor, General Goldfein, and supporting the Armed Overwatch program and supporting Special Operations Command's procurement of that program, the need for a platform that is light, cheap, particularly as we're having a budget conversation, rugged, and able to be co-located with those special operators. And I think it's useful to point out how much it helps you continue that shift of your 4th and 5th gen fleet to where it rightly belongs in great power competition by having this platform continue to support our special operators. I also want our colleagues to be aware that we just had a third-party study. Thank you for your staff support of the RAND study that showed the A-10 to be 1,000% more costly than an Armed Overwatch program, the MQ-9 to be 200% more costly. I just want to confirm for the record that you still support SOCOM's procurement, which is in the president's budget of the Armed Overwatch program.
I do. As a matter of fact, I met with General Clark, the commander of the United States Special Operations Command, just last week. We had a conversation on Overwatch, and where I also talked to him about my commitment to continue to support his development of armed.
That's great. We still seem to be running into some doubts in Congress, but we now have 2 Air Force chiefs, Special Operations Command commander, name it as his #1 priority, and a third-party independent validation of that program. So hopefully we can overcome that resistance and get those special operators the armed overwatch that they need. Switching to ISR, has the Air Force or have you discussed your ISR modernization plan with the combatant commanders? What was their feedback? What effect do you think your proposals in divesting ISR capability will have on the geographic combatant commanders?
I have. And as a matter of fact, I've taken the opportunity to speak to each one of the combatant commanders, particularly those that are probably most affected or have most interest in the ISR capabilities provided by the United States Air Force. What I've articulated to them is exactly what I've articulated to this committee is we have to make a transition to the future. And I understand that they have requirements, but I will tell you their requirements well outstrip the capacity of the United States Air Force and the Joint Force as well. And so what I've talked to them about is how we together make a transition from where we are today to make sure their successors, the combatant commanders that will be here 5, 10, 15 years from now, have the capability that they will require.
I would just encourage you to keep a close eye on it. We are the next terrorist attack, and I think with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that could increasingly be likely. From that spotlight and those demands shifting right back in that direction. Right now, we're preparing for and hopefully deterring a future conflict, but that conflict we're still in. I don't think Afghanistan's done with us, even though we're pretending to be done with it. And just in the interest of time, General Raymond, just want to talk to you very quickly about tactically responsive launch. Had a successful launch. I think it's incredibly important that we have backup capabilities to Cape Canaveral, to Vandenberg. I love Cape Canaveral. It's edge of my district, but between hurricanes or some type of conflict, if we lose that platform, we need alternatives. My question, though, is it doesn't seem to be supported in the budget. So you're affirming that it's a need, but I'm looking at where the request is, and would certainly support you in that request. But where's the disconnect?
It's very important to us. We've got money in contract mechanisms with 8 different small launch providers. We utilize one of those just a couple days ago for that responsive launch. We have money to modernize our ranges both at Vandenberg and at the Cape. The range of the future, that's funded. That architecture is funded. That's en route. We're working on policies with the FAA to reduce duplication of bureaucracy, which we have done. And so there's a whole litmus test or a whole laundry list of things that we're doing. They didn't require big budget items. It was just making it happen.
Madam Chair, if I could just, General Raymond, if you could give me a more fulsome answer for the record of when we're going to get, the importance of it, but then, yes, when you plan to push for funding.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I now recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me start by just thanking my colleague and Future of Defense Task Force member, Representative Walz, for his comments on making sure we're making smart investments in the future. And when the study comes out and says that one platform costs 1,000 times more than another, it certainly should raise some eyebrows, but it should also provoke some different decisions. I think one of the best things, most important things that members of this committee, indeed members of Congress, can do to support our national security and the future of our defense is to be willing to make tough sacrifices when it comes to the equities that we have in our parochial interests, in our districts. I will tell you that the largest employer in the largest and toughest city I represent makes the new engines for the A-10. But I'm not afraid to sit here and say that we need to get rid of Cold War aircraft to make room for new ones. Now, just last week, we saw a senator attack the department's request to retire 42 A-10s. General Brown, tell me, what can you do with this money? What will you do with the dollars that you can save if you retire these old aircraft?
I appreciate the question, and as you described, what we'll be able to do then is be able to put that money into future capability and really drive down also our sustainment costs, as was just mentioned. When it costs 1,000 or 200% more to operate, we're able to take that money and that savings and put it into modernization. We put it into sustainment, and we put it in and be able to put it into manpower to be able to operate the new capability.
And do the alternative systems that can replace the A-10 have the same capabilities?
By and large, they do. And I'll tell you from my experience, not only as the Indo-PACOM commander, but I was also the air component commander for the second year of the Defeat ISIS campaign. And when a JDAM comes off an airplane, it doesn't matter whether it's an A-10, a B-1, or a B-52. It's just going to have the same impact. And it's those things that we're able to do a bit differently and use all of our capability, and to be able to be multi-role was important to me as not only as an Air Force officer and an air component commander, but I also think for the Joint Force as well.
What is the risk of not retiring old legacy systems to be willing to invest in new capabilities?
I put it in really the four categories that I've kind of already highlighted. It'd be in modernization, manpower, maintenance, and operational risk. Being able to modernize to make sure we have the capabilities against the future threats that we already foresee that are coming our way, particularly with the People's Republic of China. From a manpower standpoint, many of those airmen that are operating and maintaining the equipment we have today are the same airmen that we're going to need to put on that modernized equipment. And we've got to make a transition because they don't get trained overnight to be able to bring on that capability. From a maintenance and sustainment piece, the longer we hold on to older aircraft, and what we've seen is our aircraft break more often, they take longer to fix, and it takes more money to maintain them. That's also costing us. And then last but not least is operationally. It impacts our readiness. It impacts and puts airmen and other joint teammates and our allies and partners at risk when we have substandard equipment or substandard to the threat, their capability. And then most importantly, it puts some of our national security objectives at risk as well.
Well, yesterday we heard from numerous colleagues of mine on this committee how shameful it is that our Navy fleet is so much older than the Chinese fleet. Well, here we have an opportunity to modernize our aircraft, and I think we should take it. General Brown, hearing this from the Navy and the Marine Corps as well, General Berger called for a hearing on modernization where we can discuss the risks and benefits of freeing up resources from less relevant systems for future modernization. Do you agree that such a hearing would be useful? And if it is scheduled, would you agree to participate?
I welcome the opportunity, and I'd be very happy to fully participate in
Thank you. Someone is not muted, but I shall continue. In your joint statement, you highlighted suicide prevention as one of your top priorities for the airmen and guardians within your service. I'm personally very passionate about mental health suicide prevention in the military, and later today I'm formally introducing the Brandon Act, which would create a mechanism for service members to seek help about suicidal ideation outside of their chain of command. I'm under no delusion that the Brandon Act will solve all the military's problems regarding suicide, but it's a step in the right direction and has a sign-off from organizations like TAPS, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, American, and others. We've received pushback from DoD about the Brandon Act, but no alternative suggestions have been put forward. Will you give your support to measures like the Brandon Act that provide a release valve in the worst-case scenarios?
I will.
Thank you, General Brown. I yield back.
Thank you. And Mr. Johnson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Roth, it was great having you at Barksdale recently to see firsthand the great work our airmen are doing in Northwest Louisiana. And as you're aware, the work done on base is critically important to maintaining our national security, especially as we continue our ongoing nuclear modernization efforts. As you know, one issue I'm particularly interested in is the ongoing struggle to construct the new entrance gate and the access road at Barksdale. The state and local governments have invested considerable amounts to construct the interchange that will allow traffic to flow to the new gate from the interstates. The point is that the state and local governments have held strong to their end of the bargain and committed millions of dollars to the project based on assurances that the Air Force will see the project through. To be frank, the Air Force has fumbled the ball on this critical project. First, the project was severely underbid, and then there was an unwillingness to reprogram funds to solve that shortfall. So I certainly appreciate that the new gate was listed on the Air Force's unfunded priority list for this fiscal year. Grateful for that. And I'm going to work with all my colleagues to make sure we get this squared away once and for all. But my question is, Mr. Roth, will the Air Force commit to seeing this project through and to reaffirming to stakeholders that they can trust when the Air Force says it's going to do something, that promise will actually be kept?
Yes, I mean, we are committed to working with our partners here to make sure that the project happens.
Thank you for that. And on a different note, I was very pleased to see the line item in FY 22 budget request to construct our weapons generation facility at Barksdale. That's been a big focus of mine and many in the Louisiana delegation for some time now. Can you or General Brown comment on the strategic value that a WGF at Barksdale will bring to our country and the versatility that it will provide to the Air Force in ensuring that we have a strong strategic deterrent?
Sure. Weapon generation facility will actually make it much easier for our airmen to be responsive in how we actually generate combat power from our, particularly from our bomber bases and from our nuclear bases that support ICBM fields. And so not only for Barksdale, but for the other locations where we actually build out weapons generation facilities and modernize our capability to match up with the not only the technology and platforms we're providing, but also to make sure it actually works well to support us against whatever threats might come our way.
Thank you for that, General. On the strategic importance of the aircraft itself, in the past year, we've seen B-52s from Barksdale and elsewhere deployed all over the world, from Europe and the Middle East over to the Indo-Pacific. And according to the Air Force, the current B-52 engines will become unsustainable by 2030. Secretary Roth, what is the Air Force doing to ensure the B-52's engines are replaced before that looming deadline?
We have an ongoing acquisition program to replace the engines, and not only that, but we've actually put that program on the new modern accelerated acquisition kind of a process. We're using some of the authorities that we've gotten over the last couple of years. And so our estimate is using some of the new, what's so-called mid-tier acquisition authorities, that we'll be able to shave about 3 years off the acquisition lead time in order to make that happen.
We're very grateful for that prioritization. And as you and I were walking beneath those big birds of B-52s not long ago, I remarked about the engineering marvel that will be a 100-year aircraft is projected. It's really amazing. General Brown, limited time I have left. With the limited availability of the B-1 and the B-2 bombers right now, and the B-21 still in development, what would be the impact of a significant delay to the B-52 re-engineering effort from an operational perspective?
It actually decrease our operational availability, and that's why going down the path of the modernization and the engine as well, and as you described, nearing 100 years old, it's important that we make the right efforts to continue the modernization so we have the operational availability and the flexibility to provide air power anytime, anywhere in support of our combatant commanders.
Well, I'm out of time. I'll yield back, but I just thank you all for your service very much, and thanks for your time today. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Horsford, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Horsford appears frozen. Do you want to test your audio, Mr. Horsford?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Mr. Horsford, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying. General Brown, thank you for being here today. General Roth as well. I wanted to start first regarding the MQ-9 Reaper. I was disappointed to see that for a second year in a row, the Air Force is trying to end procurement of the MQ-9 in the FY22 presidential budget request. As I'm sure you know, the MQ-9 plays a critical role in my district. Creech Air Force Base is the central hub for global intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, as well as hunter-killer operations. The airmen of the 432nd Wing play an irreplaceable role as the eyes and ears of our deployed commanders. protecting our troops and interests 24/7, 365 days. Last year, despite the Air Force's first attempt to end production, MQ-9 combat lines were the #1 unfunded priority from U.S. Central Command. So it is with good reason that in the last NDAA, Congress prevented the department from ending MQ-9 production and instead procured an additional 16 aircraft. This procurement was a positive step towards meeting the needs of the joint force, but the demand for MQ-9s by combatant commanders still far outweighs what the Air Force can currently resource. Many of our combatant commands have very little persistent surveillance capability and are leasing contractor-owned, contractor-operated MQ-9A combat lines to mitigate their ISR collection gap. So I'm concerned that shutdown of the MQ-9A production line or a reduction of the MQ-9 combat lines with no fully funded follow-up capability at scale leaves the nation's warfighters to make do with an already insufficient number of MQ-9As and poses a risk to the combatant command's ability to conduct operations. So General Brown, is there currently a program of record to replace the MQ-9?
There are several programs of record that actually, as we look at our ISR portfolio, that will not only, I wouldn't say replace MQ-9, because MQ-9 will actually be into our force into the middle of the next decade. But it's the force mix of capability that is required that includes the MQ-9, but other platforms. What I'd like to be able to do is come back to you in a classified briefing to provide you some details on those other programs.
Thank you. And again, I understand the constraints the Air Force is grappling with in this year's budget. I further understand and support the bias the services must have towards modernizing to win in the future operating environment. And while I support any efforts the service may be making towards a next generation capability, we cannot overlook the incredible value the MQ-9 platform provides to commanders today. The MQ-9 is the most cost-effective platform the Air Force owns. It flies 11% of the total Air Force flying hours at only 2.6% of the Air Force's total flying hour cost. So no other aircraft provides this much capability at this cost point, none. So this leads me to my second question, General Brown. Would continued procurement of the MQ-9 at levels consistent with the FY21 NDAA place potential development of next generation unmanned capabilities at risk?
I appreciate the question, but I'd say it would. And this is where, as the Air Force Chief of Staff and as I look to the future, it's how we balance between our current capabilities to support today's requirements with the MQ-9 that will be here to the middle of the next decade, but also having capabilities so that we can actually still be able to operate into the future, that it provides ISR capability that's not only persistent like the MQ-9, but is connected and also survivable in what I expect potentially a highly contested environment in the future.
Thank you, General Brown, and I look forward to following up with you and working closely with the Air Force to protect this vital capability. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford. Mr. Carl, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Ranking Member Rogers. Gentlemen, I'd like to talk about the KC-46. Although I am a freshman to Congress here, I'm not a freshman in the KC-46 program. I was actually part of the team that put together the package with Airbus to bring it into Mobile, Alabama, which we do have it there now, Airbus USA. So I'm very familiar. We won the contract, we lost the contract. We won the contract, we lost the contract. So here we sit 10 years later. We're 7 years behind delivery on this project so far. And now we're being told it's going to be 2024 before it's ever delivered. 2024 before it's ever delivered. That's going to put it roughly it's going to put it 10 years behind, roughly. not to mention all the upcharges on the spare parts. My question is to you, General Brown. Our fleet, our fighters that are in Europe, do I understand it correctly that we're refueling those in behind an Airbus tanker in Europe right now?
Actually, our fighters and aircraft all across the world operate with their allies and partners. The bulk of our refueling is done by...
But we do have an Airbus that can refuel it.
We do. But
Okay.
we also have a number of other capabilities, mostly the United States Air Force using the KC-135 in Europe.
Okay, KC-1, but we're paying right now for a KC-46 we're being delivered that has got practically no use for what it was actually being built for at this moment. So my next question is, Mr. Ross, knowing that we've got an aircraft that could be built in America that could have been already delivered, because we're up to about 3 a month coming out of Mobile right now, not this particular plane, but basically the same scale. Why are we not bringing this back up for a bid? We're 4 years down the road today, or 3 years down the road today, according to Boeing's numbers, which could easily change to another 3 years. Why are we not looking at splitting this contract up? Where's our sense of loyalty here? Are we more loyal to, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, talk down to you this way, but the taxpayers are paying for something we're not receiving. So I show no loyalty to what Boeing is doing to us here. So my question is why are we not rebidding this and looking at it again?
Again, as we've discussed this morning, our sense from both an operational and from a business management perspective right now is to try to make the current contract work as best we can. I take your point in terms of the history of the contract, but we think we would be best served. We're concerned that if we try to go into a new contractual vehicle, that would put additional delays into the program that we simply don't think would be efficacious for us. We are in a mode of accepting the KC-46s. We're trying to right-size the tanker fleet by retiring older tankers while we bring the KC-46 in.
So,
I'll take your point. We'll look at it. But right now, our business sense is that we need to work with all our stakeholders to make the KC-46 program work as best we can.
in all due respect, sir, I've been in business my entire life. If I had a contract with somebody and I was 4 years behind delivering or 10 years behind, I think they would have a right to even ask for a discount. I brought that up at one point, which everyone laughed at me on the discount idea. But we are dealing with that's okay. I had several laugh at me about that. But please, let's take a look at this. It's not just building the aircraft in Mobile. It's not just building the aircraft with a company that's in my district. It's about building an aircraft. I'm worried about our Air Force and our refueling possibilities of our aging aircraft. It is a huge issue that I think we really need to push to the front of profits of anybody. So, I respect y'all's job. I respect you being here today, and I appreciate your service to this country. And General Raymond, I'm sorry we don't hit you with tough questions today. You get a free ride. Okay. Well, thank you, and I return my time back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Mr. Franklin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A number of my previous questions have been asked, so I've got one that may be a little unfair for you, but I want to ask it anyway, just because it's something that I'm curious about as we get all these posture hearings. But a lot of talk in both written and oral testimony about the threat of China. We all know that. That's not just what we're hearing here today. It's come from all the other services as well. But I notice in the written testimony, and as we've seen in all the other services, the talk of climate change. I'm curious, Secretary Roth, is there money allocated within this current year budget for climate change programs or anything that the Department of the Air Force or the Space Command have any purview over?
There is money in our budget. For example, we budgeted $68 million for essentially to improve our installation resilience, taking a look, for example, at power sources and water sources and see if there's some targeted investments we can make to improve our resilience in that area. We also have, as part of that $68 million, we'll look at where our cybersecurity vulnerabilities are on basis. And we'll also look to see where we can make some improvements in our emergency management procedures. And, when something does happen, what are some improved procedures and processes we can put in place? So that's the only money I'm aware of that's explicitly targeted for sort of climate change installation resilience. I would also say, in terms of our operational requirements, operational resilience is very important to us as well, and particularly aircraft engines. In the total DoD enterprise, we, the Air Force, use about 2/3 of the fuels that's spent by the entire DoD enterprise, largely driven, obviously, by our airplanes. And so to the extent that we can invest in new technologies as we re-engine, for example, the B-52, or as we look to the next generation aircraft, if we can reduce the fuel consumption by some significant percentage, that'd be an enormous readiness improvement because it would reduce our logistics footprint as we try to do agile basing and moving people around as well. So we'll also have some targeted investments, actually predate some of this, to look in terms of can we reduce our fuel usage and reduce our logistics footprint as well.
All right, thank you. It's just a concern to me that our Commander-in-Chief says that the #1 threat to United States national security is climate change, and yet I'm not hearing that coming from the services. I'm just glad to know that even though the top-line budget isn't what most of the services would like, that you're not specifically feeling the haircut on that with climate change initiatives. But thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Mr. Green has rejoined us. Mr. Green, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, and of course, Ranking Member, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The United States Air Force is clearly the best Air Force in the world, and I think it's a combination of Congress making sure that you have the resources that you need and great predecessors and your work to the generals who are here for us today, General Brown, and your work, your predecessor's work in leading the institution, the United States Air Force, to greatness. I have deployed many times as an Army physician and infantry officer with the support of the Air Force, and I must tell you, when you talk about cutting A-10s, we Army guys get really scared about that, but I understand. I also want to thank you. I've listened in and out today because I've had to go back and forth between HASC and Foreign Affairs to the comments about China and the pacing threat, and I really appreciate the recognition of that. My first question is really about their increased activity in Taiwanese airspace, the invasions of Taiwan's airspace. We build our military to deter first, and then when they can't deter, then fight and win the wars. Do you feel as if this increase in Taiwan shows that perhaps our deterrent effect with China has deteriorated or isn't where we need it to be?
What I would tell you is there's probably a combination of the two, and the fact that as you see the People's Liberation Army Air Force to continue to increase its capability and its operational tempo, which I saw as a PACAF commander in watching how they will actually, in certain cases, based on world events or regional events, will increase their tempo to put pressure on our partners in the region. We see that with Taiwan. We saw it here recently with Malaysia, and it's a technique that's been used by the Chinese to put pressure on us. At the same time, though, I think the ability of the United States Air Force with our joint partners, particularly being able to operate in international areas, to fly, sell, and operate whenever international law allows, is an important aspect to discredit the activity by the Chinese.
And the question is deterrence, of course, and we want to make sure that mission of deterrence is that you guys are excelling at that. So I just want to make sure you're properly resourced to do that, so that these kinds of escalations don't occur, because that's where the danger is. A quick question, and I know the point's been made earlier, but if a cut in inflation adjusted dollars, if you have a spending increase and it's less than inflation, you have a real dollar decrease, and it looks like, according to our analysis, you're going to wind up with, at DOD at least, a $4 billion cut. I know that President Biden is not a fiscal conservative. They're increasing the non-DOD, non-discretionary spending by 16%, significantly above inflation. I have a real, going back to that question of deterrence, going back to this pacing threat. I mean, are these cuts going to cause you an inability to do that deterrence mission, and that, if deterrence fails?
I will tell you, it makes it more challenging. And the aspect of not having adequate funding or having an Air Force the size that's required to execute what's been asked of us does create additional challenges. And this is why it's important for us to really do the right analysis, wargaming, to lay out the best capability for the best force mix for the United States Air Force in support of our joint teammates, and working also with the rest of the other services to ensure we have the capabilities to be able to deter, as you described.
If I could get to that sensitive topic of the A-10s, and I really just would love to hear assurance that as we downsize that force to make it more cost-effective from a maintenance standpoint, we're still able, that close air support mission that we rely so much on the Air Force for in the Army, want to know that it's on your radar screen and what your plans are to make sure that mission is still excelled.
It is definitely still on our radar screen. This is why the A-10s that we will have remaining, and really the bulk of the A-10s that we will have remaining, because we're reducing a small percentage, will still be modernized. And that mission set for close air support is not only with the A-10, but it's other capability that the United States Air Force provides to do close air support as well. So it's definitely on our radar.
Understand. Thank you, Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Jackson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Rogers for holding the hearing today. Also want to thank Secretary Roth, General Brown, and General Raymond for being here today. Thank you, sir. During my brief tenure in Congress, I've met many people, more people than I can count, from DOD. However, the Department of the Air Force, including all three of you, have been phenomenal in working with my team, and I want to tell you thank you. General Brown, you were the very first DOD senior leader to reach out to me and introduce yourself once I was elected, and I really appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Your leadership has set an example for the rest of the Air Force, as has the team at Sheppard Air Force Base. They directly welcomed me with open arms from the base, from base leadership all the way down to the young airmen that I got to speak to when I was there just a few weeks after being sworn in. So thank you, sir, for that and the leadership there. General Brown, I greatly appreciate your offer to come visit Sheppard Air Force Base with me. I think to see the NATO jet pilot training program in the base later this year. I look forward to seeing that happen. My staff is going to work with your staff, and hopefully we can find a time and get that scheduled. Thank you, sir. My first question, the current Child Development Center at Sheppard Air Force Base was constructed in 1973 as a military detainment facility initially. Earlier this year, Secretary Roth sent me a letter stating that Sheppard CDC was going to be the #1 priority for CDC MILCON in the Air Force. I have the letter here. Mr. Chairman, or Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that this letter received from Secretary Roth be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. I greatly appreciate your engagement. Thank you, sir. I also appreciate the follow-through, as I was glad to see full funding for the Sheppard CDC military construction project in this year's budget request. Mr. Roth, I just wanted to confirm that this is still a top CDC MILCON project for the Air Force.
Yes, sir. The fact that it's in the budget, I think, answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My second question, I want to shift to the CV-22 nacelle improvement modifications. This work will increase overall aircraft readiness and availability. It will reduce platform operating life cycle cost and mitigate the impacts to the aircraft performance and survivability. These all sound like critical improvements to me, so we need to bring as much of this work forward as we can. Mr. Roth, could you explain to the committee exactly what the CV-22 nacelle improvement program hopes to accomplish, and does the Air Force support accelerating the CV-22 nacelle improvement program?
Yeah, to the best of my understanding, I had to learn a little bit about this for this hearing, but it is in fact a critical area for the CV-22, providing the unique ability to fly vertically and horizontally. So the improvement effort, which is occurring at Bell's Amarillo Assembly Center, will improve our readiness and it will reduce our repair time associated with the nacelle. So we've structured a contract to accommodate an accelerated purchase, and if additional funding becomes available, we'll accelerate it perhaps even further.
Thank you, sir. The workforce at Bell and Amarillo stand ready to complete that work. Last thing I'd like to talk about real quickly is the Advanced Pilot Training Program and the new T-7 Alpha Red Hawk, which will be replacing the aging T-38 fleet. Some of these T-38s have been flown in my district over 50 years, and we have seen too many of these aircraft with serious safety issues. When I was reviewing the budget request for this year, I noticed that funding for the Advanced Pilot Training Program was decreased relative to what last year's Future Years Defense Program had laid out. General Brown, is this program that is seeing a cut because of the proposed overall budget decrease that is not in line with the National Defense Strategy? And can you tell us what has changed regarding the new request or requirement, and what are the potential consequences of this decrease in funding?
Well, the decrease in funding, particularly on the T-7, was based on Milestone C and some technical issues that had that slide a bit to the right. Our focus and commitment to the T-7 has not waned. We want to make sure the money aligns with where the program is.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate that, and I will do my part on the committee here to try to make sure that we meet our commitment there. Thank you all for your responses. I'm in favor of finding ways to save money where we can, but investments in our Air Force and our people are going to be critical to ensuring we're able to compete and win on the global stage. I look forward to working with each of you and my colleagues here on the committee to address the pacing threats and the accelerating threat that we face, and to provide our young men and women the training and the resources they need to accomplish their mission. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson, and I will now recognize our last member to ask questions, Mr. Moore. Thank you for your patience, and our witnesses as well. Thank you for staying to answer all of the members' questions. Mr. Moore, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Number last on the list, but number one in our hearts, I think, right? I'm going to echo what Representative Jackson said. In my 6 months, the three of you stand out as being extremely available and willing to be collaborative as we solve problems, as we work to celebrate wins and interact. I view our role as that from Congress with the Department of Defense, and you three exemplify that. So thank you for that time that you've spent with our team. I'll be very plain here. The budget's inadequate. That's been discussed. One thing that I was excited to see was that the GBSD program is fully funded through FY22. As I've dug into this issue, I also keep it very simple in that nuclear deterrence has saved lives in this globe. It has reduced conflict. It is a part and should be a part of our strategy going forward. And if that is the case, we must invest in it. It's very simple and very clear to me. And I get that there's a lot of complexity with it, and we're willing to dig into those details again in that collaborative way. But we've seen the data are clear, and we've seen too much success to let that go by the wayside. So it's an area that we're focused on. I'll ask a couple questions on that to Secretary Roth, and can you just share with us anything in particular, as we wrap up today's hearing, just to what's being done to ensure that stays on track?
Well, again, and you and I had the opportunity to visit the program offices on both the government side and on the contractor side, and what I walked away very impressed with is on both sides, they are using the most modern techniques, the most modern digital engineering, the digital trinity in terms of using open systems architecture, agile software, using the digital engineering and the like. So far that's been working out extraordinarily well, and both sides claim that they are committed to going forward. So they've hit every significant milestone to date, and that's a good sign. Early in the program, to be sure, but they're hitting every milestone so far. And to your point, we take very seriously our piece of the nuclear triad. We own 2/3 of the nuclear triad. This is the ground portion of that, and so it's in all of our interests. We've lost margin in terms of delaying this as long as we've delayed it. So we need to get on with it. If there's any significant delay in the program, it increases risks dramatically, and that's not what we want to do. So it's incumbent now on the program managers to keep the program on track, and I'm very confident that we have excellent leaders leadership on both sides.
Excellent. That was the next question. Is any additional consequences by delaying it? Some members have suggested doing that while we have to allow for less pressure on the Air Force budget. What would you see as any particular consequences in delaying it?
Well, again, in a sense, you are where you are. We've delayed making a decision on the Minuteman III and its follow-on for a decade or more. And so we've lost margin, period. And so if we want a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent, that is an ICBM, GBSD is it.
Excellent. Thank you. And General Brown, every time I visit the Ogden Air Logistics Complex, the depot work that's being done in my district, I learn something new. There's a lot of discussion also around the F-35, but I find it, worth highlighting that the F-35 has the best mission-capable rate of fighters in the Air Force, and that's improved from 61% to 76% between FY19 and FY20. An important thing to note. And my question in a more broad sense is I'm proud of the resiliency and the patriotism displayed through the pandemic and the fact that depots suffered little to no delay in aircraft maintenance and contributed to this success. Building off of the great work from our air logistic complexes, can you provide an update on the Air Force Organic Industrial Base plan and what the Air Force is doing to invest and improve in our depot facilities?
Sure. As part of the Organic Industrial Base Master Plan, it's how we take a look at how we reduce costs. And so it's really a 20-year look to not only look at how we keep up with what the capacity is required today, catch up where we're behind, but really leap forward. Over the course of the past 4 budget cycles, we put about $2 billion into our 3 depots around the Air Force. But the key part is now how do we look to the future and kind of lead up. And some of this is actually how we restructure some of our depots, how we do robotic aspects of our depots to include, like, for example, laser paint removal for some of our fighters, and using technology to help work that process. At the same time, we got an outstanding workforce, and they've been done great work throughout the pandemic as well to keep us on track.
Excellent, thank you. And my time is up, but I'll just like to also comment, General Raymond, no one would care more about their guardians and that workforce than you, and I see that exemplified. Would love another chance to dig into some of the issues and the developments you'd like to see there. So sorry we ran out of time.
No worries, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your thoughtful testimony and taking the time to present the budget to the committee. A few closing words as we wrap up. I just wanted to say that, I agree with Mr. Moore and his comments. I think that, the nuclear deterrent remains the cornerstone of our national defense and appreciate the Air Force's role in maintaining that critical deterrent for our nation. And secondly, just pivoting back to the comments that Admiral Davidson made to the Senate earlier this year, I think you heard many members reflect on the fact that we think there is a sense of urgency and immediacy to making sure that we can counter any threats in the Pacific today. So I'll close there, and the hearing is adjourned.